Redditors who have worked around death/burial, what's your best ghost story? I used to be a driver for a funeral home corporation. Like, drive the hearse and pick up the bodies. Never had anything creepy happen. A few funny things, a few traumatic things. In general, it was a chill job. However, I did get incredibly uncomfortable one night picking up a man who died at home. He still had the defibrillator leads on his chest and his eyes were closed, which is unusual because the eyes are always open. He just looked like he was asleep or unconscious, not rigid or pale or anything. I just had this sinking feeling for about half an hour in traffic that he was going to suddenly gasp and wake up in the body bag. Then it hit me. That would be the coolest thing ever. I'd take him home and he'd be back with his family. So I just kind of drove slowly and turned up some music and sang along and talked to him. When I got him to the funeral home, I left him out of the cooler for about an hour while I did paperwork and played on my phone. When I got another call, I checked on him and his limbs had started to stiffen. I was kind of bummed. I put him in the cooler and went on my next call. Story 2. In mortuary school, I had a dream about embalming my dad, but he was still alive. My classmates tried to tell me it was just tissue gas and he wasn't actually alive and get my crap together. Then, when I cut him open, he gasped a faint, "Help me." So then the next day I had to go to lab, my second case ever, and I told my classmates about the dream. We had a chuckle about it and started to work on our body. Old lady. Had pretty severe arthritis, so when I was breaking the rigor, she literally clutched my hand. It's the only time I ever got some serious heebie-effing-jeebies. I had to step away from her and collect myself for a minute, lol. Okay, just talking about random things that you don't normally think about. Mortuary school's an actual thing. Yeah, people need to go get educated on how to deal with deceased bodies, obviously, but just not something that I personally ever thought about majoring in when I was in college. Moving on. Story 3. During my apprenticeship, I worked at a funeral home said to be haunted by an old funeral director assistant who had had a heart attack in the building and died. All he ever did was mess with the chapel lights, and if you called him out, something like, "John, the family's coming, please don't," they would return to normal. Not really sure if I believe it was really haunted, but saying something always fixed the issue, so I kept doing it my entire time there. Story 4. My roomie/best bud is a mortician, and I'm around the funeral home a fair amount myself and know the staff pretty well. I've spent the night there before. Nothing weird happens there. I've had some experiences I can't explain, so I was a little surprised none of the staff ever had an odd experience, especially since some of them do believe in ghosts and whatnot. But they told me, if ghosts were real, why in the world would they linger at a funeral home? It's just a transition piece, like an airport. No one wants to just stay in the damn airport. Haunt the place you died, or the people you love, or the home you never want to leave, or however it works, if it works. Who would want to linger in a funeral home they have no attachment to, that their body only visited after they were already gone? Story 5. I used to work on an oncology ward as a nurse. Our side rooms were kept for end-of-life patients on palliative care, and one patient that we had been nursing for a few good weeks died early one morning. Last offices had already been done by the night staff, and the patient moved to the hospital morgue, so all that remained was to clear the room of personal belongings and tidy up. I sent a student nurse that I was monitoring at the time to do this whilst I got on with the drug round. The student had known the patient fairly well and was comfortable with this job. About 10 minutes after, a colleague came to me and told me that my student had come flying out of the side room, white as a sheet, and was sobbing in the staff room. I went to find out what the problem was, and the student told me she had been clearing out the sink area in the bathroom, had glanced up and seen the deceased patient reflected in the mirror looking at her over her shoulder. My student was a sensible girl, not given to hysterics, but for the remainder of her placement on that ward, she would not go near that side room. Story 6. Not a funeral home, but I worked at one of the last booth homes for pregnant girls in the early 2000s. Lots of dead babies and some dead moms in the history of that campus. We had any number of creepy things happen, to the point that I brought it up in a staff meeting and the social workers just said, "Oh, must be time to have the building blessed again." But what stuck with me was the baby swing. I came into the living room and found it swinging by itself after all the teenagers were in bed. Now, this was an ancient mechanical wind-up swing. You had to turn a crank to start it. There was no electricity involved. There was no way it just started on its own. and there it was, swinging full force. I was completely terrified, but I just said, "If you want to swing, I'll be happy to wind up the swing for you, but when you do it on your own, it frightens people." Every night for the rest of the year or so I worked there, I wound that swing up and let it go. I told other staff members, and I believe they did the same. I like to think it was a sweet baby ghost who just wanted attention, and we gave it attention. Later, they closed the program for parenting teens and made the whole place a homeless shelter. Now I'm sitting here worrying about my ghost baby. Is it lonely? I hope not. Story 7. Not me, but a colleague found a dead person in a dark, smoke-filled, burned-out building during the mop-up of firefighting operations. As unfortunately happens sometimes, you find them by stepping on them. If they're still intact, you kind of bounce off of them. If they're fried, you can often crunch them up pretty bad under your heavy boot. Well, this guy stood right on a badly burned corpse's sternum. Crunch, right into the chest cavity. When he tried to pull his foot out, it got stuck in the ribs and the body came up at him, burned up arms flailing about. Took him a few tries with what looked like a zombie stuck on his leg. He needed quite a bit of counseling. Poor dude. Yeah, this is something that probably would scar my mind forever. Not just seeing a burned up cadaver, but stepping on it into the chest cavity, and then when you're trying to get away from it, it's just clinging to you because you're all up in the rib cages. That's creepy, but thanks for sharing. Story 8. My grandfather died a while back. One day, me and a bunch of my cousins were playing in the front yard, rural area, since on weekends all the family likes to hang out together. So we're out having fun and see Lolo, grandfather, walking towards the house. We all greet him and he smiles at us. He walks up the porch into the house and hangs his hat by the door. We continue playing until we hear crying from the inside of the house and my uncle driving fast up the driveway. We all rush in to see what's going on and see everybody bunched up in the kitchen crying, telling us that Lolo died early that morning and that they just found out. He lives a few towns away. We looked at each other and told the grown-ups, no, we just saw him come into the house. They didn't believe us, and we told them that he really did not that long ago, and he even hung up his hat by the door. So everybody rushes to the door, and his hat was hanging right where we said it was. He doesn't go anywhere without that hat. So me and my cousins are running all over the house calling for him, while our parents are so quiet and freaking out. He actually did die earlier that morning, and my grandmother couldn't find his hat anywhere in their house. We left the hat where it was, and nobody ever touched it. Story 9. Not a ghost story, but when I was in the Army, I served on a few honor guard duties for transporting soldiers' remains. One time, we were taking Korean War area remains that had been uncovered in Korea and transported to the USA for identification. For most of the remains, the transfer cases, industrial aluminum caskets, were very light, like you'd expect with 40-year-old remains. A couple of the cases were heavy, like a couple 100 pounds. I've never stopped wondering what was in those cases. It wasn't 40-year-old bones. Story 10. I'm an ICU RN. We had a septic patient in the unit. She was 29 weeks pregnant. She went into labor on my shift and we delivered her baby, stillborn. I did post-mortem care on the baby, retrieved the proper transport container, and walked the baby down to the morgue. It was the middle of the night. I'm in an elevator alone. I hear a baby start wailing. I absolutely lose my crap and rip open the cover, and just as I go to zip down the bag, I hear a calming male voice say, "Hush, little one, I've got you. No need to cry." The crying stopped immediately. Shaking, I opened the bag and saw exactly what I expected to see. A deceased 29-week-only baby. I'm a big bearded 40-year-old ICU nurse, and that was the scariest crap I've ever experienced. No one believes me to this day. I don't even want to speculate what the crying or the voice was. God, even typing that out, I felt my chest tightening. Story 11. Mom told me stories when I was growing up. Her first job out of nursing school was an RN in the ER of an old hospital in Virginia in the mid-1980s. There was the man in the hat in Patient 1. Most of the nurses had stories about them. The man in the hat would show up and stand outside of rooms after visiting hours. The patients often died soon after. Patient 1 was a woman in a very old hospital gown. She'd walk in the halls before entering random rooms. Those patients usually coded. They took the man to be an omen of death and the woman to be a heads up to grab the crash cart. Story 12. My grandfather died when I was in my early 20s. He and I were very close. I struggled with his death and barely cried at his funeral because I knew if I did, I wouldn't stop. A few weeks of me avoiding all mention of him and gruffly rebuffing well-meaning friends and family when asked about him, I dreamed the most coherent dream I've ever had. I was at his home, outside, which was my favorite place to be. My mother, grandmother, and all the rest of the family were inside. And then, from his workshop, my grandfather came walking up to me and said, "Hey, Princess," his nickname for me. And I was so happy in my dream because here he was, alive and well, and clearly this had all been a mistake. So I said, "Papa, let's get inside, quick. Everyone will be so excited to see you." And he smiled real sad and shook his head and said, "Baby, I can't stay. I'm only here to see you and I have to go back." And I said, "Why just me?" And he said, "Because we have to say goodbye." I woke up sobbing. I never dreamed of him again, but I will go to my own grave convinced he did come back to say goodbye because he knew I couldn't let him go. Story 13. I have a million that are more grotesque and gory than this one, but it stands out to me. I was once working at a mortuary and had to go pick up a man from the medical examiner's office. When you do that, at least where I'm from, you get a receipt when they release the body to you. The receipt has all the personal belongings that are with the deceased. When I brought the man back to the office, I opened up the body bag to make sure all the belongings were there and double-checking the receipt. When I opened up the bag, I was stunned to find this dude looked almost exactly like me. He was my age, had similar tattoos in similar spots, had the same long hair I do, even had the same style of jewelry I was wearing. It took me so off guard that I stood there in an existential crisis until the embalmer came in and was like, "Hey, Spartan M00, how's it going?" Oh, holy crap, that guy looks like you. It's the only case I've had nightmares about. I'll be the one in the body bag with the deceased man opening me up. Story 14. I used to work in a nursing home. The residents in certain rooms would complain about a man in their room at night, but hallucinations are common in the elderly, so it wasn't really noticed. One night I was mopping the dining room, which had huge windows overlooking the garden. It was around 1 a.m., so pitch black outside and low lighting inside. I had this horrible feeling of being watched, so I looked up and reflected in the window was a man behind me. He had a brown suit on, a bowler hat, and the cruelest look on his face. He grinned and his mouth was too big. This happened in seconds, and when I turned around, there was obviously no one there, but I'll never forget that look of evil on his face. I paid more attention to the residents after that, and they'd all seen the same man. He just enjoyed terrorizing people. Story 15. My grandfather was extremely sick in the days leading up to his death. He'd worked with the asbestos for all his working life and had an extremely debilitating form as a result of it. He couldn't speak, and he hadn't spoken for a month leading up to his death. He couldn't even communicate. On the day of his death, he looked at my mother and said, "The angel is back." My mother was stunned. She asked what he meant, and he said, "The angel is back, and this time he wants me to come with him." My mother looked at the corner of the room where he was looking, turned back to him and said, "Dad, there's nobody there." He didn't respond. He died that night. That was 20 years ago, and my mother never spoke of it again. She told me the story when I was old enough, just like she told my brothers, but my sister never got to the age where she was old enough. She succumbed to her disease when she was 7, after battling it her entire life, and on the days leading up to her death, she kept speaking about this butterfly who would visit her. My brothers and I would sit with her and nod along. We kind of just thought she'd developed this imaginary friend to help her through what she was struggling with. One day, she shot up and told us, "The butterfly is back, and he wants me to follow him." I saw my mother's face drop. She made the decision not to tell my sister she was dying, and my sister just believed she was going through a rough patch like she often did. Not that the doctors had told my mother it was terminal, but my sister said, in the next second, "I'm going to die, aren't I?" That's what the butterfly said. He told me I'm going to die. My mother admitted to her that yes, she was going to die. She said, "Oh, okay," then laid down and died, with my brothers, my mum, and I cuddling her in bed. I don't know what to believe about the afterlife, but I have to think there must be one. That there's some truth behind the legend of the Grim Reaper. That at some point, something comes to lead all of us away from life, because otherwise, I have no way of coming to terms with what I've experienced. Story 16. Back when I worked in cardiology, we had this one single room at the ass end of the floor. We'd put palliative patients or patients that needed isolation in there. I swear, 3 different patients in the years I worked there told me they had woken in the middle of the night and seen an old man and a little girl holding hands, both standing at the foot of the bed, doing nothing. Story 17. I used to work as a nursing assistant in assisted living communities. Usually, when a resident started to need hospice, they were transferred out to a higher level of care. So I didn't see death for a long time. When I first started, my favorite resident, let's call her Marilyn, would play Scrabble with me. She was completely alert and oriented. Sometimes she likes to sit quietly with an iPod Shuffle clipped onto her vest and these huge headphones. She loved music. Slowly, she started to decline. I would help her get ready for bed, and she would get upset when she forgot how to do something. The only thing that calmed her down was playing music off of my phone. She liked Frank Sinatra and the Beatles. Her independent ability declined rapidly, and soon she was bedridden. Still, loved listening to music. This was during COVID, and her quality of life was diminishing so quickly that we didn't transfer her out. She had an apartment at the facility with all her belongings where she was comfortable. By the end, her dementia had progressed to the point that she couldn't remember how to swallow. Marilyn passed away with me, the head nurse, and her family at her bedside in her apartment, Unit 202. I did her post-mortem care afterwards, styled her hair how she liked to wear it, even clipped her little iPod onto her shirt. A few days after she died, a woman in 203, her neighbor, kept wandering into the lobby during night shift, always at 3 a.m. She complained of loud music coming from Unit 202. The apartment was vacant, just full of Marilyn's belongings. She said the music was so loud it was deafening. Whenever the night shift worker went to check, he didn't hear anything. Not really creepy, more sad. I miss Marilyn. Story 18. I worked in a ward nursing for 10 years. The spookiest thing that happened was a doctor hiding under the bed when I cleaned my first body and scaring the crap out of me. That definitely helped me get over the fear factor of working with the dead. Bodies groan and leak when you roll them to clean them, but that's normal. You just talk to them nicely as if they were alive. E.g., we're just going to put you in your nicest pajamas for your son to come and say goodbye. I'll give your face a clean. I'll paint your nails fresh as I know you like them this way. On most wards, there was a haunted room that staff members would avoid. They all said it was haunted because the buzzer would mysteriously go off by itself. Funnily enough, it would always stop buzzing randomly after maintenance came to fix it. Story 20. I was an RN and was working in a very well-off town in MS. The hospital had 2 ICUs, with the second one being an overflow type unit on the 3rd floor. There were 7 rooms in that unit, and room 2 was haunted. Numerous times, different nurses watched something walk into the room, but the room would be empty without a patient in it. One time, a nurse had an actual patient in room 2. It was about 4 a.m., and the nurse was going to do a dressing change. She took the stuff into the room, and the patient asked what she was going to do. She said, "Change your dressings." The patient said, "Oh no, that other nurse was just sent in there about 30 minutes ago and did it." The nurse looked, and yes, the dressing was fresh. She went out to the desk and told the one other nurse, "Thanks for doing that." The nurse was baffled and said, "I didn't change the dressing." They both freaked out a bit. Rumor has it that an RN that worked for the hospital a long time died in that room. The hospital is now a dorm for a big college, so fun times may be had by a bunch of college students. Story 20. Might be a little tangential, but bear with me. For many years, I was in the U.S. Navy based in Japan. After the tsunami hit Fukushima, we spent a few months off the coast resupplying helicopters that were ferrying supplies and searching for bodies of people who were washed out to sea. When we did find a body, we were instructed to put them in a body bag and store those bags in an area called the starboard castleway, sheltered area outside of the pressurized interior, until a Japanese Coast Guard helicopter could come by to retrieve them. For a while after we finished with that mission, some of my shipmates reportedly saw ghosts in that area of the ship. I didn't see any ghosts, but it was not uncommon for me to feel some unnatural chills there. Story 21. When my cousin was 18, he was in a bad wreck, and him, his girlfriend, and her sister were all pronounced dead at the scene. The police arrived to inform my aunt, his mom, and she asked that he be sent to a specific funeral home. While they were preparing to embalm him, he raised up and asked, "Where the hell am I?" The funeral director said it was the first time he ever had to go home and change pants. I should add that the top of his head was open and his brain was exposed. He was sent to the hospital. The same police officer came to my aunt's to tell her he was not dead but in the hospital. They thought he'd be in a vegetative state, but a few weeks later he walked out of the hospital. My aunt said it was the worst and best day of her life. So, skull cracked open, brain exposed, somehow survived despite being pronounced dead. That's a pretty miraculous recovery. I mean, glad that he was able to make it through it and not sustain brain damage, but dang, your girlfriend and sister still didn't make it. I mean, that's wild. That's a wild one. Story 22. I work in long-term enhanced care. People don't get better, but we keep them comfortable. A couple of stories I can think of. 1. A husband and wife, both with severe, almost non-verbal dementia in the same room but different beds. I have my back to the husband as I'm turning the wife who's facing him. Suddenly, her eyes get wide and she looks terrified. She says, "He doesn't look very good with his face blue like that." I'm like, oh crap, did he die? But when I turned around, he was alive and sleeping. I don't know what that woman saw. 2. A tall shadow man on one specific unit. Multiple people have seen it. Some even following it into rooms thinking it's a patient, but then no one's there. 3. There was a man who had a cardiac event while sitting on the toilet. He fell forward and put a hole in the bathroom wall. He died. Soon after, a new woman moves into the room after everything is fixed. She comes out to the nurse's station one night pissed off. She says, "Who's going to tell that man to get out of my room? And when are they fixing the giant hole in the bathroom?" And 4. A very nice family was sitting with a resident while he died. The man had been basically comatose for 2 days already. The sister comes out and asks for a Bible. This was not a religious family. She said he had sat straight up, eyes bugged out, and started screaming, then flopped back down. I was like, say no more, and found her a Bible. Story 23. I used to be a security guard at a hospital. One night, while doing my rounds, I went into the surgery wing and was walking down a hallway when I saw a doctor looking at the whiteboard where all the scheduled surgeries are written down. I said, "Hello, doctor," and kept going. The doctor didn't say anything back, just kept studying the whiteboard. When I got back to the security office, I was telling one of the guys that's been there for years about how I greeted this doctor, and he didn't say anything back. I asked if that's the a-hole they told me to watch out for. I was asked where I saw him, and I said the surgery ward, and he gave me a smirk. He then explained that the surgery ward closes at 9 p.m., and that all patients are moved into monitoring wards. There should be no one there. He then asked me if this doctor was studying the schedule board. I said yes, and he then told me that I just met Dr. Luisiti. Apparently, some many years ago, one of the surgeons went up to the helipad and jumped off of the building. Seems like he never stopped working, though. Story 24. Not me, but my mom's ex's story. My grandpa was the mortician for a small town in the late 60s. The morgue was attached to the house that my mom lived in. That's just how it was, and it didn't bother her. One day, her boyfriend, Tom, came over to the house and no one was home. They had been dating for a while, and he was comfortable going inside and waiting for my mom to come home. On the way into the house, Tom noticed that the door and the windows into the morgue were open, so he checked it out and found it empty, closed everything, and went into the house. A few minutes later, he heard a large slamming noise come from the morgue, so he ran to see what was wrong and found that the doors and windows had been thrown fully open again. He got out of there real quick. When he told my grandpa about what happened, my grandpa just calmly explained that they had picked up Mrs. that morning and the spirits were welcoming her and visiting with her. Next time, Tom should just leave the doors and windows open. Story 25. I have several stories from when I worked at a mortuary transport tech. The job was basically transporting the deceased from where they were to where they needed to go. Turns out, dead people can have a lot of appointments. One time, though, I had an experience I've never forgotten. I was dropping someone off at the science donation place. This is when you donate your body to science and they take it from there. So I wheeled in the deceased, unlocked the freezer, and did all my stuff I had to do in there. I placed him on the board, got the lift out, and placed him on the shelf. The interesting thing about the freezer was that most everything, once it's processed, was wrapped in this blue tape type thing, and you could definitely tell what was inside. Legs, hands, feet, etc. Kind of interesting to me at the time. Anyway, I shut the freezer and locked it back up, and started wheeling the gurney back over to the garage door. The science drop-off and processing area was a big L shape, with the freezer off to the larger long portion, and then you turn the corner and there's desks and filing cabinets and whatnot. I about had a heart attack as I turned the corner and there's just this guy standing there examining files in the file cabinet. Looked just like you or me, dressed modernly, but out of place for what people normally wear back there. I stopped and said that he'd have to forgive me, but he almost gave me a heart attack. It didn't look like he heard me at all, or even knew I was there. I should mention, this was also about 1 a.m., and I'd never seen anyone at the place this late. So I said, well, sorry if I startled you or anything, and went on about my finishing up stuff. Got the gurney back in the van, closed and locked the large garage door from the inside. All the while, this guy's just standing there, staring at an open file in front of him, not paying any attention to me. I had to use the bathroom, so I told him that's where I'd be going and I'd be right back. Again, no response. I thought maybe he's deaf and couldn't hear me. So I went to the bathroom and came back to the garage, and the guy is gone, but the file cabinet is still open. I didn't know where he went, and I hadn't heard anyone walk down the hallway past the bathroom. I checked and made sure everything I was responsible for was still locked, and it was. So I just announced that I was going to be leaving and locking up to set the alarm. No response. And that's what I did, and left. I'm not sure who he was, or is, or what happened, but it was definitely an odd experience and one I still remember perfectly. I have a few other memories about my time at the job, if anyone wants to hear. Nothing like what happened above, though. Story 26. I used to work at this very old country club. I think it was built in the late 1800s. There was a really bad natural disaster, and the ballroom-type room became a temporary morgue while they cleaned up the town. I usually was responsible for closing up shop since I was a bartender and would normally be the last one left. Man, did that place give me the heebie-jeebies. Nothing outworked ghostly, but many times I'd be leaving the parking lot only to see that lights are still on in the barroom, which I swore I had turned off. So the worst part was having to go back in and walk through the dark building to go turn off some lights. Not only that, but the stereo would turn back on all the time. Silverware and dishes would go missing all the time, when you could have sworn you had left something in that spot. Overall, great place to work at, but the open secret was that this place was haunted as F. Story 27. Obligatory haven't worked around death/burial, but as a part of my culture, we frequently visit the graveyard to pay respects to our deceased. My brother passed away when he was 8 months old from leukemia. He was born with it, and eventually he was buried next to my grandmother, who passed away over a decade later. My uncle would frequently visit her grave, but he also left little toy cars on my brother's grave. And once, there is a new burial a few plots down, and the family was holding their overnight vigils for their family member. When he stopped by our family plot, he was approached by a member of the other family. Apparently, late at night, they would see glimpses of a young boy playing around our family plot, but no one could approach him. My uncle looked over at my brother's grave and noticed that the toy cars were missing. Story 28. Junior doctor on the wards, doing a night shift, called to verify a death. Enter the private bay. It's all a bit grim, slightly gloomy room. Patient is lying there. Old man. Looks peaceful. Start my checks. Stethoscope out. No signs of active respiration. No heart sounds. Rub the sternum for a response. None. Time to get closer and check the CNS for any signs of life. I lift the eyelids up, reach for my pen torch, balancing closer to the patient. That's when it happens. The patient lurches forward, his face now inches away from mine. I scream. Nurses rush in and ask what's happened. What was that noise? Why so pale? You look like you've seen a ghost. That's when I realize. I lean in too close and my leg brushed against the bed controls raising the bed. Nurses couldn't stop laughing as they offered to make me a cup of tea. Story 29. When I was a kid, I had a great uncle who was the caretaker for a local cemetery. Sometimes my dad would go work with him just to make some extra dough. One time, my pops was unavailable, so he gave the job to me. Had to bury a guy. Nothing ghostly happened. It's a strange dichotomy, though. On one hand, there's a family on one of the worst days of their lives, and on the other, there's me and old Uncle Pete waiting to fill the grave. It had rained all that week. Graves fill up with a lot of water when that happens. As the lift was lowering the vault, in case peeps don't know, burial requires a coffin to be sealed in a huge concrete vault, into the grave, my uncle looked at me and said, crap, I hope he's got his swimming trunks on. And that was the day that I learned you can't inject humor in a dark situation. For about a year, I delivered in-home medical equipment to hospice patients. Saw some people in really bad shape. The kind of shape where if it were me, I'd be saying, y'all need to end me. Show me some goddamn mercy here. I also learned that cancer has a very distinct aroma. The stronger the aroma, the sooner that person would be passing on. I'd be in the middle of a hospital bed, set up with an oxygen concentrator and everything else, and I'd be like, me or one of the other guys will be back here tomorrow or the day after. And usually that's what would happen. There was a time I pulled up to a residence just to deliver some backup oxygen tanks. A guy probably in his 40s meets me in the driveway and says he's not sure if they're gonna need it. Then he hears his name called from inside, followed by, he's gone, he's gone. Dude went back inside, and I just said, call your nurse right away, and I got in my truck and left. The denial some people fall into is tough sometimes. We would have families that'd be like, can you park your truck really far away so nobody in the neighborhood knows we have hospice in here? Sorry, it's a crappy time, but no, I sure can't do that. The worst were the children cases. Ugh. I remember one kid, he was maybe 11. His room was just plastered with photos, all of him with nearly every player on the local NFL team. He had been gifted so many things from that team, his room looked like a storefront. I set up his equipment on a Tuesday, and an aide was telling me, obviously they know it's terminal, but they're just looking forward to getting him out of the hospital so he can at least be at home for his last few months. I was back by Friday clearing everything out because the little fellow was home for a grand total of like 36 hours before he left. Effing dagger in the heart. His mother was a complete disaster, walking around the house, clutching his framed school photo she had taken off the wall. No ghostly stuff, though. No weird occurrences. No weird noises or anything. Also worked in a hospital when I was younger and would mop and buff the floors in the morgue. The orderlies told me they used to prank new guys by having one of them lay on the table and then jump up at them. Thankfully, they never did that to me. Wow, I just rambled way too long. Sorry, everybody. Ain't nobody give a good goddamn about your stories, fool. And now you talking to yourself. People gonna think you nuts. Story 30. I work for a cardiac ICU. We have quite a lot of death around here. That being said, we had one patient that comes to mind. I'll call him Greg G. Fake name. Greg was in the unit for months. He fought very hard to stay alive every day, and to his credit, he was getting better for a good space of time. Greg was fairly old, late 70s or early 80s. The thing is, he initially looked very young and acted very hip. He became a meme around the unit, and everyone loved him because he was an old white dude who loved rap, Tupac and Biggie, and would throw gang signs sarcastically as a nonverbal cue that he was feeling okay. He had a trach-in, so he couldn't talk. He also had his family bring mood lights into his room that synced with his music. I kid you not, his room was playing rap and rave mode sometimes. We called him DJ Greggy G, and he loved it. Unfortunately, he took a turn for the worse. His condition deteriorated rapidly, and ultimately he died. We were devastated as a unit. His family let us keep his mood lights, and to this day, we keep them plugged in at the nurse's station. However, one day the mood lights turned off. We were saddened. Nobody could get them working, but then they turned on. We were happy, and then they started flashing super irrationally. Then we heard the patient that was in Greg's old room start screaming. We went in to check on her. She was a confused old lady who would say some pretty wild things, but this one was weird. She said she was watching the flashing lights in the hall. She could see them from her room, to be fair. Then she said she saw a silhouette of a man casted into the wall from the lights. Then she started specifically yelling, "Tell Greg to leave. It's not his room anymore. Tell Greg to go." There's no way she knew it was Greg's room. And with her memory being the way it was, there's also no way she would remember even if she did get told. Kinda spooky. Story 31. I work overnights in an assisted living facility, ALF, that mostly deals with dementia and Alzheimer's. When someone who's lived there for a while starts actively dying, it's like the rest of the residents get restless. Like they know death is pacing the halls. Often, the restless residents will, one by one, start talking while in their rooms. I used to go in and check on them, ask what they're saying, who they're talking to. They all respond, "The girl in the closet." I have closed closets, I've left small lights on for them, I've gotten up and taken her to the living room with me, and still she stared at the doorless linen closet in the hall and chattered away, not always comprehensible. It only stops after the actively dying patient finally passes. A few residents who have passed started talking to the girl in the closet just days before they sharply decline and start dying. One of the most recent was in October. I'd go in at night to change her diaper, and she'd be propped up on an arm in her bed, chatting away to the girl. She smiled at me one time and pointed at the closet and said, "Oh, haven't you met her? She's such a lovely girl. See, this is my nephew I told you about." I said I'd be back later and didn't go back for almost an hour when she was asleep again. Story 32. I'm not in the funeral business, but I was a cop in the 80s. 3 in the morning, walking the streets, checking business doors to make sure they were locked. A few days before, our only mortuary caught fire and burned. It was basically burned to the ground, but it was still standing. The front door was intact. As I was walking past it, I instinctively checked the door and found it unlocked, so I went in. The entire building was charred black. I could see nothing but black charred wood everywhere. I walked the length of the hall to the sanctuary. What I saw next made me step back a few. In the middle of this charred blackened room, on a small pedestal, was a white crushed velvet child's coffin. It looked like it would hold a toddler. Not one drop, if soot, was on the coffin. Not a speck, nada. The entire building was totally destroyed, but here sat this pristine coffin. I turned and left. Story 33. While I was in nursing school, I worked as a night shift tech on a general hospital floor. Our sister floor became the COVID floor during the pandemic. One night, we got a call from upstairs that a patient had passed away and they were out of body bags. So a nurse and I went upstairs to bring them one. On our way back to our floor, the elevator doors closed like normal, but the elevator didn't go anywhere. All of a sudden, the doors opened back up and then closed again, and we were moving. We looked at each other and the nurse said out loud, "It's okay, we'll show you the way out. Hospital windows don't open like the old days, so I guess souls have to take the elevator." Story 34. I lived at the cemetery I worked at. I had several weird occurrences. It was a house with an office attached. Next to the kitchen was an office that led through to another sitting room. I was in the kitchen cooking and my dog got up suddenly, barking at the office doorway. Then, as he's barking, he slowly and fearfully makes his way through that office towards the sitting room doorway. I'm like, "What the heck, doggo?" So I go into the office and he's at the doorway barking full steam, but will not enter the sitting room. I go into the sitting room to check it out and I see nothing. I try to call him in and he just continues to bark. Hair on his back raised, and will not cross the threshold into that room. I ended up closing the door to both rooms, and he finally calmed some, but he kept looking over there and growling under his breath towards the door. Weird. Story 35. Perhaps I'm too late for this, but I figured I'd share my story anyway. So my aunt married a man from a relatively well-off English family who had purchased part of a large mansion house near Mylor, Cornwall, rural coastal area in the south of England. As a result, when I was younger, we were occasionally invited down to spend a few nights there in the summer. It was a pretty idealistic location, with the house built on the side of a hill facing directly to the sea. As I'll explain, the house used to be a guest house, and has always been described as haunted by members of the local community. At the time of my experience, however, I didn't know the real reason why it was considered haunted, and I only found that out later. During renovations, for example, the builders had claimed to have seen the ghost of a woman in an old-fashioned dress walking down the stairs. Nevertheless, I'd never experienced anything until this happened. One summer, I brought my now ex-girlfriend to the house with me, and we stayed in a bedroom on the ground floor. It wasn't an in-suite, so to go to the loo, you would have to leave the room and walk across the hallway to the toilet across the way. In the middle of the night, my GF at the time wakes me to say that she's going to the loo and she'll be back in a moment. I sit up, groggy-eyed in the darkness, say okay, and then lie down and go back to bed. She doesn't turn the lights on, but in the darkness, I can make out her opening the door, leaving the room, and closing the door behind her. I lie down, close my eyes, and about a minute later hear the door open again, and someone walk into the room. Assuming it to be my girlfriend, I don't open my eyes, but shift to make room for her to get into bed. I hear her walk over to the bed and get in, and I reach over to embrace her, and feel what feels like the body of a woman. My eyes are still shut at this point. Suddenly, I hear a woman's voice from across from me, not my GF's, asking me, "Are you going to come tomorrow?" Realizing it's not my GF, I open my eyes in shock, and at that very moment, my girlfriend opens the door to the room. I look across and realize there's no one in the bed with me at all. I bolt up, and my GF has to spend the next hour calming me down while I explain what happened. The next day, I tell my uncle about this and ask about why the house is considered haunted. He laughs, saying I probably encountered a ghost of the people who used to stay in the guest house. I ask for an explanation, and he says that during the 1900s, there was a terrible boating accident in this part of Cornwall, and a boat, the MV Darwin, totally disappeared with something like 30-odd passengers. A large number of the presumably dead passengers were staying at the guest house, hence why locals all presume the place to be haunted. Having heard this, I can only explain it as the ghost of one of the passengers, who was presumably asking me whether I was going to come on their ill-fated boat trip the next day. Safe to say, I avoided boats for the rest of that trip. Sleep paralysis is probably the first thing that comes to mind here, but it makes for a good story, so we're gonna roll with it. You were sleeping with a ghost. Story 36. I worked as a nursing home assistant for a bit prior to grad school. I worked for a private nursing home where I would rotate between 3 different houses. Each house held 6 residents and 2 staff members. When I first started, all the residents were women. One time, my coworker and I were in the kitchen prepping lunch for the ladies when we heard a loud voice screaming, "Help me! Help me!" We exchanged a quick glance and immediately scrambled away to check on our respective residents. No one was present on my half of the house, so I went back to the kitchen. My wide-eyed coworker was there waiting for me with a perplexed expression on her face. I asked her if she had heard the voice too, and she responded that yes, she did, but that there was no one present on her side of the house. We simultaneously looked outside and saw every single one of the residents outside enjoying the rose garden. It was in that moment we both realized the voice we heard was distinctly male. I came to find out that prior to my employment, there was a male resident who was a World War II veteran with PTSD that had passed there. He would frequently hallucinate and scream for help prior to his death. Story 37. This is something my mom told me, and we've been around enough death. We were just moving from North Carolina to our new home in Massachusetts in '95. I was 4 or 5 at the time. We were just riding past that house that was one house down from ours but across the street. My mom told me that I pointed at the house and said, "Mommy, I see angels." Weird, but nothing out of the ordinary for a child. The following day in the newspaper, there in the obituary was a listing of that same house on that day I said what I said, that the owner died of a heart attack. Story 38. Finally, my time has come. I'm a body removal tech for a funeral home. I've worked that job for a few years, but when that story happened, I was working for a different company. It was my first day, and we went to pick up a larger person who died from a heart attack, it seemed, and it kinda shocked me. His face was bloody and scrunched like he was in pain, and I was like, what a horrible way to go. So day goes on, and then when I went to sleep, I could not fall asleep. I kept having flashes of that poor guy in my head. I tossed and turned until I heard, "Don't worry, I'm fine." And then I was able to sleep for the rest of the night. There was another one, but I don't want to talk about it because the subject is too sensitive and I don't want to trigger anyone. Other than that, I often stayed late at the funeral home to clean the place and never saw or heard anything. It's quite peaceful, actually. Story 39. When I was young, let's say around 8 or 9, I had an unusual experience. One night, as I lay asleep in bed, I hear an RC toy car start zipping around my bedroom. I figured it was probably my older brother just messing with me, but he was adamant it was not him. Okay, whatever. The next day, I took pains to hide the remote where no one could find it, behind some insulation in a room my parents were remodeling. Sure enough, about the same time the next night, that little car starts jetting back and forth and actually starts running into the door. I was certain it was my brother, so I sprung the door open to emptiness. I peeked into my brother's room only to find him fast asleep. The car? It had gone into the unfinished room and was idling in the middle of the room. Okay, now I'm freaked out. Third night, I removed the battery from both the remote and the car itself. Tested it. No way was it moving with both batteries taken out. I was certain nothing would come again the next night. Wrong. Same ritual of hiding the batteryless remote, this time in the shed out back. Almost the exact same time that night, that little effer starts zipping around my bedroom again. So I did what any sensible 8-year-old would do and smashed the bejesus out of the car. Yeah, not just any sensible 8-year-old, I think any sensible, rational human being in general. If that actually happened, smash the car, throw it in a dumpster on the other side of town, and if it comes back somehow after that, yeah, you're definitely being spooked. Story 40. My dad used to be a night shift guard in a hospital with a morgue in it, and on his shift, a patient had died, and after all the cleaning up was done, a nurse had to stay alone with the corpse, but came back terrified and asked my dad to accompany her. Apparently, the corpse was making strange noises. The noises were not really paranormal, though. Apparently just gases passing, but probably a pretty spooky thing for a young nurse to experience alone. Also, in the same building, my dad recalled a coworker hearing footsteps that followed her with a delay, kind of like an echo of her own footsteps during the night shift. Probably also nothing paranormal and just an actual echo in a relatively empty building and a hint of imagination in the late hours, but who knows? Story 41. Not a ghost story, but I'm an archaeologist and spent some time conducting a survey of an island in the Pacific, where a horrific battle took place in 1944. Working in the jungle, you're surrounded by noise throughout the day. Then, on one of the last days of the journey, we reached the spot, an area surrounded by a ring of large rocks, where the Japanese garrison's commander and staff had self-unalived as organized resistance crumbled and U.S. troops closed in, after months of fighting resulting in thousands of deaths. Anyway, we were busy recording the site, and I was focused on the work because there is a lot of unexploded ordnance, bombs, landmines, grenades, you name it, to watch out for. Then, eventually, my colleague called out to me softly, "Hey, you hear that?" I looked up and asked what he meant. He said, "Dude, just listen." And we realized that the whole time we had been on the site, we had not heard a single noise. No bird calls, no insects chirping. You could hear a pin drop. The moment we walked out from the rocks, we were once again hit by the everyday sounds of jungle life. I don't necessarily believe in ghosts, but that place really did make us all uncomfortable. I'll never forget that oppressive atmosphere. Story 42. Here's a story I've literally only told a few people. Weirdest thing in my life. I'm a funeral celebrant, training to be a family celebrant, so weddings and funerals, but this involves my own mother. My mom had cancer, but I was called home as she was dying in September 2020. We didn't leave her alone for a second, so when it got to like 1 a.m., my dad told me to go to bed for a bit and he'd sit with her. A few hours later, I felt this horrendous pain rip through my torso/lungs/chest. Never felt anything like it. It felt like I was suffocating/drowning. Didn't last very long, but I couldn't move. A few minutes later, my dad came to my room and told me Mom had died. I 100% believe I felt her final pain of death. Her bed was directly below my bed in my room. In fact, I was almost directly over her as she died. She had cancer, but died of pulmonary edema, fluid on the lungs and lack of oxygen. Never felt anything else like it, but I've heard so many similar stories. And I know it sounds like I'm making it up, but why would I? Oh, and it's one reason I became a celebrant. I didn't fully before, but now I completely believe in soul/spirit/energy returning to the universe/animating force, whatever you want to call it. It was a good thing to learn amidst the grief. There is for sure more to this life than our physical bodies. Edit. I've often wondered if it was a panic attack, or something like heartburn, or just simply some psychosomatic grief reaction. It may have been, but I've had a panic attack and heartburn before, and it was a different sensation. Story 43. I'm still skeptical of things like this, but I used to work as a medic in a rural area. One call, we were transporting a patient who was actively having a heart attack. It was a decent time before we got to the hospital, and after working the patient up, IV, meds, etc., I started talking to them. At one point, this patient started talking to themselves, or so I thought. They were looking to my left and answering questions, responding, and I thought maybe they were getting confused. Then they looked at me and said, "You know, he died in here last week, but said you were so nice." This patient went on to describe a previous patient I had that died from a car accident while we were taking him to the hospital. My partner and I were talking to him as he was somewhat conscious, but his injuries were too severe to last. It was weird. Story 44. EOL Dallahir. Best ghost story is actually not really, but kinda is. So many of my clients have had loved ones who already have passed come to talk to them through the veil. It's really neat and reassuring when a dying client greets their loved one. I had one lady insist, she had been bedbound for weeks, that she was going shopping with her sister in a couple days. So much that she was agitated until we got her purse and shoes ready for her when her sister arrived. The last morning she was verbal, she woke up and said to the empty doorway, "Oh, sister is here. Told you we were going." Her sister had been gone for years. She passed away that evening. It happens more than it doesn't, and is such a source of comfort for me. Story 45. I, 27M, worked as a groundskeeper at a cemetery for 2 summers in my hometown, about 2,000 people, so everyone kind of knew each other. We were doing a cremation burial for a woman who wanted her ashes with her husband's, who had passed in 2014. So we dug the hole where his ashes were and left the box open for the family to do the rest later that day. The sexton and the administration left to do some paperwork and told me to hang out for a minute and they'll be back. So I lit a cigarette and sat down with my back against the headstone, leaning on it. After a minute or two, I heard an old voice say to me, "You shouldn't smoke." And I said, "Yeah, I know." But then it hit me that nobody else was around, so I looked and sure enough, nobody was there. So I sit next to the hole, and after I put out my cigarette, the voice comes back and asks me, "Are you burying Nora?" The wife. And I replied with, "Yes, sir." So then his voice changes from casual to excited, and he starts telling me how happy he is that it's finally happening, and that he doesn't know how long he's been waiting, but it feels like 1,000 years. After listening to him for about 5 minutes, the family shows up and the voice vanishes. I let out a few tears of joy for Mr. Edwards, the husband, left some of my trade beads underneath the box as my own little reunion/parting gift, and told the family that everything was ready for them. They saw me crying and asked if I knew Nora. I just said, only from her husband, and left the family to do their thing. Later that week, I was weed-eating the headstones. I stopped by the Edwards headstone, and for a brief moment, all I heard was laughter, a man and a woman's, like a calm wind in my ear. Then nothing but silence since. P.S. I have a few more, but feel free to ask. This is one that rests in my heart rent-free. Story 46. I was a U.S. door gunner in a Chinook in Afghanistan, and one of our tasks was transporting bodies. We were transporting a high-ranking Afghan that was killed in combat. The Afghans wanted to hold a ceremony for him, so our job was to deliver the body to a special forces camp so that they could hand him over to the Afghan National Army to conduct the ceremony. We paid special care to be respectful to the body while it was on our helicopter. Upon landing, a special forces guy pulls up on one of those four-wheelers, called Gators. He said, "Thanks, Homos," then tossed the body into the back of the Gator like a sack of potatoes, lit a cigarette, and drove off. It's not really a ghost story, but it has always reminded me that while you can mean a lot to a few, to most you mean nothing. Story 47. Years ago, I worked at a company which, at one point in the early 20th century, had been the city dispo for unclaimed bodies. Prior to our occupation, there had been 4 or 5 crematorium located in the building, though by the time I was there, we only had 2 of them converted into high-temperature ceramics kilns. These were later removed due to maintenance issues and lack of parts. In any case, the entire building was haunted, though the worst of the hauntings were in and around the 2 old retorts. Our most common ghosts were a trio of ghosts. The ghosts were a little girl, about 10 or 11, who really didn't do anything more than play and like to pull pranks on people, a tall lady who would just watch you work from time to time, and a very angry man in a suit. The girl's ghost really never did much beyond move things around, or sometimes you see her run around a corner or one of the kilns, then vanish. The lady wasn't much trouble, just felt rather sad any time we saw her or felt she was around. She didn't really do much beyond wandering around the building where the old retorts, crematoriums, were. The man, though? Oh, Lord. He was angry. Very angry. Especially towards those of us who worked the kilns/retorts. There were other spirits, too. Maybe half a dozen or so, but these 3 were the most well-known. It was always figured, given the spirits, that they were unclaimed deceased persons who ended up cremated there and buried off-site. Given the religious nature of the area and the forbidding of cremation by the church, LDS, we always figured that the spirits were making themselves known. Story 48. So, I work at an air museum part-time, more of a fun job than anything else. The museum itself has a lot of historical artifacts, aircraft that have seen action, uniforms from the deceased, and personal artifacts that were near and dear to people's hearts. The museum itself has been used as an event center, and we've had funerals and celebrations of life. This is pretty common with pilots, as there's been a lot of curse at the airfield where famous pilots tend to not live long. We refer to it as the Klingensmith curse, after a famous female pilot who died in a racing crash and was horribly mistreated by her male associates. Anyways, have had 5 pilots killed in air crashes within 10 years, and the museum held their funerals and still have their aircraft. So there's a lot of negative energy around the museum, but it's still a happy place. My boss often reports that she hears voices when she's the only one there. There are a few lights that inexplicably turn on. Things seem to move around the museum as though ground crews or pilots are still working on the planes, and we always see shadow figures darting next to the planes and exhibits. One night I was helping to clean up after an event, which meant cleaning the back bathrooms. So I grab my equipment and go to the other side of the hangar to clean. The only people in the building at the time were my event coordinator and an older male employee. As I was cleaning, though, I heard someone call my name loud and clear. "J-Mont, can you come here?" So I put down my supplies and walk out of the bathroom to report to absolutely no one. It's a big hangar and was cleared out completely, so I should have seen the person who called my name. The voice sounded like an older male, mid-60s. So thinking this is my male employee playing a trick on me, I go over and ask what's up and what he needs. He straight up tells me he did not call my name, and the event coordinator agreed as they were outside helping the band leave the parking lot. I immediately looked over to the bathrooms I just came from, and I see a shadow run in the bathroom, and the lights on that side of the hangar completely shut off for a solid 10 seconds. I will swear to this day that the museum is haunted. Story 49. I was working in ICU a few decades ago, and before that I worked in hospice, so patients passing away wasn't a big surprise. Anyways, we had a fair share of gruesome cases. A couple even involved children. Some of these young people died way too young because of accidents that came from attempted self-unaliving, or to severe car crash victims. The hospital had been in service for nearly 70 years, and there had been reported paranormal activity from when the building first opened. This has ranged from objects moving, object displacement, and lights malfunctioning. However, on the darker side, there's been cases of people seeing shadow figures and even ghost patients, especially children. Probably the worst I've heard is staff seeing a demon in dark hallways and crawling on the ceiling. I would say at least 10,000 people have passed away here, so at nighttime it can get extremely unsettling knowing that most activity is reported at night. On to the point. I was working overtime and into the night. It was around 4 a.m. if I remember correctly. My coworker at the time was in a different sector at the time when all of a sudden I heard an ear-piercing shriek. So I immediately ran to the sector he was in and saw him on the floor looking terrified. I asked him what the hell happened, and he says he saw a patient walk from room 57 to room 58. I told him that was probably just a patient that got up to use the bathroom. He said that there was only one patient in the sector and he had to use a urinal bottle for bathroom activities. I asked him if there were any other staff with him and he said, "Yes, Jared is with me, but he's behind me." I said, "Then who was it then?" All he did was shrug. Me and him passed it off as a hallucination and continued our shift. After a while, me and him are cleaning in the same hallway and hear thuds down the hall. Relax, it's just another staff member, which it fortunately was. After that, we begin to hear much fainter thuds from below us. There was other staff on the bottom floor, so we passed it off as that. We learned that when we heard the thuds that they had just left for a staff change days later. Anyways, I'm walking to room 75 and I see something zoom past me in the corner of my eye. I asked my coworker, "What was that?" "What was what?" my coworker said. "The little shadow that just went past us," I said. "Stop saying random crap trying to scare me. It's not funny," my coworker said. As soon as I said that, we hear a door slam shut. At this point, we're getting freaked out, and I called out to Jared, to which he didn't respond. We learned later Jared had went to the bottom floor. Then another door slammed shut. Then, me and my coworker see something we cannot describe. It looked like a blob of darkness coming straight at us. It sped and made a ghastly moan. We started running for our lives. We stopped at the end of the sector and glanced back. Nothing. No evidence that we had just been attacked. Me and my coworker glance down the hall into the darkness and see nothing but inky black. Whatever had followed us went away. After that, the next 2 hours were uneventful until a giant crash came from a different sector on our floor. All of the staff rushes up to the source of the noise and sees a large piece of equipment had crashed on the floor. "Check the patient in room 57, I say. The person who checked the patient comes back and says the patient was startled, but not scared. The rest of the night consisted of everybody seeing crap in the corner of our eye, but nothing else big happened. Probably the scariest experience of my life. After that night, I had no more night shifts on hospice. Eventually, I transferred to ICU and only worked into 2 a.m. Story 50. Used to work for hospice as a nurse's aide and would talk to patients. I told families that it helped to reassure patients if there was something that might be troubling them or that they might worry about. Promise you'll take care of the roses or the pets. Keep the family recipes secret, or pass them on. Clean out the garage. Talk to Benny about rehab again. Make sure the bills get paid. How you'll treasure their memories and tell stories about them every time you get together. Let them know it's okay to let go, instead of telling them to never leave you, because they love you and they'll try to stay, but it's hurting them. So many families let me know it helped them talk and share, and so many times I heard they'd step out of the room and the patient would pass away. Like, okay, I can go now. It's not a ghost story, I guess. It's more like this is how to not make someone a ghost story, because they'll be at peace. I thought it was cool that most every house I went to was full of grief, but also love. And it wasn't scary or awful to be with these dead people because of that. Story 51. Worked at an old skilled nursing facility. The place was built in 1888. The original place was for women who would sign over their estates to the facility and live out the rest of their lives there. You have to remember that back in the day, women were not allowed to own property, so when their spouse or family died, they would have to move. This building had been around for over 100 years before I started to work there. It still stands, but now it's just executive offices for the administration, and the owners built a new building just down the street from the original building. I was a CNA. The women would die at the facility regularly, as people do in their old age. Before dying, people in one wing would complain about children playing a week prior. Always the same two, a boy and a girl, dressed in church clothes, they always said. Then the person who was dying would tell the staff, "I saw the doctor," or "the man with the satchel came to see me." Every single one of them would say this. Then they would say, "I'm ready to go now." And they would die within 2 days. When someone died, we would see a woman in early century clothing, with laced-up boots and white towels over her arm. She would go to that room, and that's how we knew they had died. I miss that building. I miss the ghosts. Story 52. Not my story, but one of my law professors. The professor taught torts and insurance law. In insurance, there's this idea of an insurance interest, or means that in order to take out a policy on someone/something, you have to have some kind of connection to them/it that means you want them/it safe. Life insurance. Need to have some kind of relation to the person that makes them more valuable to you alive than dead, is the short version. Parent, child, employer. The specifics are outlined in your country/state's insurance code. Importantly, uncle is not on that list by default. Deadbeat and his wife are looking for some easy money. Deadbeat and wife live together with his mom, brother, and nephew. Nephew loves to play baseball. Wife has an idea. Great idea. She hates her in-laws, and Deadbeat doesn't have a single cell rattling around in his skull, apparently. So Deadbeat goes to the local insurance agent, friend of the family, takes out a life insurance policy on nephew, payable to Deadbeat. Insurance agent signs off on it because he knows the family. Deadbeat and wife pack up all their stuff from the house and put it in their cars. They wait until brother goes to work. Time to get to work. Deadbeat goes to his sleeping nephew and stabs him to death. Wife stabs grandma to death in her chair. They douse the place in gasoline and light up the house. Investigators put it all together pretty easily, considering Deadbeat and wife still have all their stuff conveniently packed up in their cars. Those two idiots are still in jail as far as I know. My professor gets involved in the story because brother is suing the insurance company for writing the policy that got his son killed. Insurance company says to him, "Well, the contract says it pays out X, so we'll pay you X." Professor is on the phone and says, "Friend, we aren't suing you under the contract. We're suing in negligence. We would like all of your money." Negotiations were short, meaning they take months instead of years. Professor is taking a stroll one evening, talking to the insurance company's lawyer on the phone. Conversation ends and he hangs up. Baseball falls out of a tree next to him. Nephew loved baseball. It's the anniversary of nephew's death. Some things are just too creepy to make up. Story 53. My mother-in-law died a few years ago, and my wife and I were at the funeral home going over some arrangements one evening. It was around 6-ish, and the sun had gone down, with most of the staff being gone already. It was a little too spooky, but it's all in our heads. However, I did go on to use the restroom before leaving, and upon entering the bathroom, which had one urinal and one toilet, I immediately heard the toilet flush. I proceeded to use the urinal, and by the time I was washing my hands, I thought it strange that nobody had exited from the stall where the toilet had flushed. I pushed the door slightly to the stall, and the toilet was empty. LOL. IDK if it was just a coincidence or a ghost relieving himself, but either way, I was the only one in that bathroom. So another thing that you just don't think about is ghosts relieving themselves. I don't think ghosts can eat, so they can't take a ghostly dump in a toilet, but yeah, I don't know, it's fun to imagine. Story 54. I don't worry around death, but my childhood home and current home are both haunted. Current house is haunted by something almost childlike. Never anything bad happens, but things go missing for a few days and randomly appear in an obvious place you've checked a dozen times. My childhood home was haunted by the ghosts of my maternal grandparents, primarily my grandpa, but we would occasionally see my grandma too. First experience seeing them was when my sister and I, 7 and 8 at the time, shared a room. We were woken up by our bedroom door opening. We saw the two of them standing there, but my grandma died before my parents got married, and my grandpa died when I was less than a year old. We didn't have pics around the house of them, just artwork they'd painted. We weren't afraid or anything, more annoyed that we were woken up. The next day, we scolded our parents for letting their friends come up and disturb us. They didn't have anyone over, and upon describing them to our parents, my mom started crying. She knew that her dad had been hanging around. After he died, they couldn't find the deed to the house. Literally moved every item out, room by room, going through every nook and cranny. They had cleared out all the items from my grandpa's room, except the TV and the stand. While my mom was in the kitchen, the TV in his room turned on. She went and turned it off. Old electronics, you know? She went back to the kitchen to continue what she was doing. A few minutes later, the TV turned back on. This happened a couple more times. Then, the last time she walked in the room, sitting right there in the middle of the room was an envelope containing the deed and other paperwork for the house and some bonds my grandfather had. Story 55. Mine is actually really wholesome. I worked with a family who lost their about 30-year-old daughter unexpectedly, and when I went to take a lock of her hair for her mom, I was really struck by this strong scent of sweet artificial grape, which must have been from her shampoo because even after I washed the hair I had cut with different shampoo, it still smelled like grape. For the whole week that her body/ashes were in my care, I would randomly smell that scent pretty much every time I picked up her file. I figured that it was just a coincidence because the lock of hair was with the file, although it was sealed in a Ziploc bag, which was tucked inside a fairly thick cardboard folder. But then when I went to put her ashes in the urn, I could smell it again, even though the file and lock of hair were on the other side of the funeral home. I mentioned it to her parents when they came to pick up the urn, and they laughed and told me that the grape scent was her favorite shampoo/body wash, and she was probably hanging out because she would have been very curious/interested in my job and what I do. So far, so kind of boring, right? The interesting/wholesome part of this story is that a few months later, I worked with another family who lost their about 20-year-old daughter in very similar circumstances, and her family happened to order almost the exact same urn. That week, I kept smelling something sweet, and it would start to trigger a memory, but then disappear before I could remember where I had smelled it before. When the urn came in, I opened the box, and it was like being punched in the face with grape shampoo, and I suddenly realized what I had been smelling all week. I was like, oh, it's her name. It was the same thing as before. Every time I handled the file, grape shampoo. When I went to transfer the ashes into the urn, grape shampoo. Every time I handled the urn before giving it to her parents, grape shampoo. I like to joke that I've handled so many dead bodies that I'm immune to ghosts, because I've never have spooky or supernatural experiences. Yet I'm also 100% certain that that girl with the grape shampoo made a point of coming back to let me know that she was going to take care of the younger one, and I told her parents as much when they came to pick up her urn. I haven't smelled grape shampoo since. Story 56. My grandmother passed away a few months ago. She was dying of kidney failure, with her heart eventually succumbing to cardiac arrest. I saw her in the hospital, and as I live interstate, I made a point of calling her twice a day to chat and see how she was coping. The evening she passed, I received a phone call from her, a little frantic and hallucinatory, probably from pain relief. What warmed my heart the most was that despite her being in such a state and barely comprehensible, she somehow managed to dial all the correct digits to my number, and I was about to have a shower, narrowly almost missing her call by mere seconds. I'm convinced she knew her time was near and was calling to say goodbye. She passed away about 1 hour afterwards. It was a few weeks later, and I was outside watching the stars in the night sky, missing her tremendously. Out of seemingly nowhere, I heard her voice saying, "Don't worry about me. Get on with your life. You won't believe it. It's beautiful here." That gave me hope for a beautiful afterlife, and that maybe we do get to see those we lost again after all. Story 57. I work at a hospital in the lab and was dropping off a bunch of limbs to the morgue after hours. We put them in the freezer with the bodies. I went in, put the legs and arms in the back, and the door was closed, but it doesn't lock. Anyways, couldn't get the door open. I was stuck, and the morgue is in a weird spot of the hospital, like it's 3 rooms, and to get to it, it's a very big freeze and no one can hear. Also, in the basement in a tunnel that connects 2 buildings. Anyways, I was screaming, as loud as I could, trying to get out. The freezer was packed. I accidentally hit a dead body, and I did get out a few minutes later. The part that's so strange was my patient I had for 4 months. We talked a lot, and I told him at one point how scared I was of getting locked in the morgue because he asked about it. He knew he was dying and was the curious type of thing. Anyways, he died that day and was in the morgue when this happened, so I like to think it was him playing a prank on me. Story 58. My wife and I caught a Nazi baby ghost. We were U.S. soldiers stationed in Germany at a hospital that used to belong to the Nazis. We had a load of ghost stories. There were secret passages in the town, sub-basements on sub-basements, and my duties included histology, autopsies, and morgue. I could tell stories about that morgue. Creepy would be an understatement. One ghost story was that the Nazis took imperfect babies to the sub-basements to do the things Nazis do. If you went down deep, you could hear the babies crying. We had to go down to one of the deeper levels to clear out a storage room, and a wailing noise echoed down the halls. It sounded just like a baby crying. I mean, exactly like a baby crying. We had a master key, so we investigated. We eventually traced it to a random room with a tiny window. There was a pipe leading to the surface for airflow. The window was cracked open. When the wind blew just right, it made a wailing sound as it passed through the crack. We closed the window the rest of the way and solved the mystery of the Nazi baby ghost. Story 59. I used to work in landscape maintenance at a cemetery. After bodies were buried, we would put sod over the top of the graves and water it daily until it grew fully and meshed with the existing grass. There would be graves that were right next to each other with sod planted at the same time. Same ground conditions, same sunlight conditions, and the same amount of water used in the sod. For some reason, the sod would flourish on one grave, and on the other, the sod would die and turn back into dirt. Not sure if this was because the sod was bad or if it was indicative of the type of life the person buried underneath it lived. Definitely made you think. So the rational part of me says, yeah, just bad patch of sod, but if this is indeed indicative of the kind of person that's buried, if it's just like a jerk face and the sod doesn't grow and turns into dirt, that would be a kind of an interesting metaphysical thing to explore. Story 60. My aunt was a cemetery worker and told me an absolute cracker that happened to her. There was an old chap who would come every Monday at the same time, rain, hail, or shine, and put roses on his wife's grave. He was a well-known regular visitor and would always stop and chat to the workers, including my aunt. Anyway, she was working on this fine Monday and she saw this chap at his wife's grave like usual. He just changed out the roses and she went over to ask if he'd like to give the old ones to her to dispose of. What followed was a normal 20-minute chat talking about all kinds of things. He had to go, so she waved him off and he left. The next day when she turned up for work, there was a new work order for that morning, so grabbing the backhoe, she went out to find the plot. Turns out it was right next to the chap's wife. Frowning, she checked the work order again and saw it was the old roses guy. She dug the grave, got it prettied up for the service, and later that morning the funeral home turned up to inter him. She went up to the funeral guy in charge, you get to know everyone after a while, and asked why the rush to bury the old chap. Mortuary worker, what do you mean why the rush? Aunt, well, he was here yesterday putting roses on his wife's grave. What happened to him? Mortuary worker, he died on Thursday last week. Aunt, no, he was here yesterday. Points at the fresh roses on his wife's grave. Mortuary worker, looking at the flowers. You sure it was him? Aunt, starting to get the shivers. Yeah, we had a chat like we always do. He was talking about being excited for his new granddaughter. Mortuary worker. Wait, what? How did you know about that? She hasn't even told her husband she's pregnant yet. Aunt points at the chap's grave. He told me yesterday. Mortuary worker. Wow. Yep. Bonafide ghost. Story 61. I work as a first responder, so very close proximity to death. I had not had many ghost encounters on the job. I would say that this is more of a paranormal/spirit story. I was working overtime on a different crew than my usual one, when we were paged to a very bad MVA. It was a truck full of people that had been hit head-on by one of those huge crane trucks. There were multiple fatalities, one of them being a younger kid that we ended up having to extricate and perform CPR on. He unfortunately did not make it and was pronounced on the scene. After the scene was wrapping up with 3 patients being transported by ambulance and 1 by air ambulance, we were waiting for the coroner to come and get the kid that didn't make it. We had to put a sheet over him. Take into account, this was a super warm summer day with no air movement, not a hint of a breeze. Myself and the rest of the crew look over and see the sheet that had been placed over the young kid begin to lift up several inches into the air like his body was pushing it up, and then settled back onto him, like air was escaping. To this day, we're all sure we witnessed a soul leaving a body. Story 62. I don't work in healthcare, but my mom and several other relatives do. Not counting my room, the other doctors in my family are really skeptical people. When my grandfather died from cancer and back lung in the 90s, nearly all of my family members swore they saw him walking down the hallway in his usual clothes, not in a hospital gown, and around the corner. My uncle was the only one that followed and caught up in time to see the elevator doors close. The elevator was across from the nurse's station, so he walked them over to see if they saw anything. They said no and asked what he saw. I just said that he thought a man walked into the elevator as the doors had just closed, and they kind of laughed and said, "Oh, honey, those elevators are messed up. They do that all the time on their own." For the next 20-ish hours, most of my family have had encounters with my grandfather. My mom's house would frequently fill with an unbearable smell of cigarettes. Nobody in my house smoked, there were only 3 of us, and we lived in a very remote area with no close neighbors. My grandfather smoked, of course, so we always assumed it was him hanging around the house. My other family members would also strongly smell other things associated with him. Baking bread, celery, fennel, and other ingredients he would make sausage with, the wine, and the smell of the cellar he would make it in. There was never an explanation for those smells every time it would happen. My cousin, when he was super young, would also claim that my grandfather would stop by and talk to him. He would occasionally introduce him to other family members that had long since passed away well before any of us were born. He knew of a great uncle that had been killed at sea during World War II. He knew so much about him that only my older relatives could verify, like that he played guitar in Chicago. Oddly enough, I found a wooden guitar while cleaning out my grandfather's house a few summers ago, and it had been manufactured in Chicago. My cousin also talked about how funny this uncle was, and we caught him dying laughing by himself on more than one occasion. When asked what was so funny, he would just say that Uncle's name is being silly. The only thing that I ever really knew about this relative was that he was the funny one in the family. They all had a great sense of humor, but apparently this uncle was on another level. It really broke the family when they received word that he was killed. He was buried at sea, so they never even got to properly say bye to him. When my grandmother passed away in 2018, all of the encounters with my grandfather just stopped for everyone. It was pretty sad. Some of them found comfort in thinking he was still hanging around. Him and my grandmother had been married since they were teenagers. I think he was definitely waiting on her before he moved on. There haven't been any unexplainable stories shared since 2018. It almost feels like we really lost everyone back then, but there's an enormous comfort in knowing that they all moved on with each other. Story 63. I remember this guy that was digging the graves. He was telling me a story how one night while he was preparing another hole for the next day, he was digging and a skeleton got out of a nearby grave and tried to scare him. He kept on digging. The skeleton tried to scare him on, but the guy wasn't bothered and kept digging. After a while, the skeleton saw he didn't scare the man, so he started walking towards the cemetery exit, but the gates were locked. So, when he almost jumped the fence, the man that was digging caught one of the skeleton's arms and said, "We joke and laugh, but we don't leave the yard." Okay, what the heck? I don't know if this is satire or not, but yeah, got more questions. You need to elaborate, sir, on this story of yours. Story 64. Only really weird thing that happened in an EMI nursing home was I'm in this one room that we tried to keep for the palliative care patients near the nurses' station. We had an old boy who passed away. He had dementia and whilst with us was very resistant to personal care. He was a big guy and doubly incontinent, so we would unfortunately have to support best we could to meet his needs. He would yell at us the whole time, "Bugger off! Bugger off!" during any personal care we gave him. Sadly, he passed away and the room remained empty for a few months. I recall I went in after the previous shift and laid him out waiting for the coroner and complained massively that no one had opened the window to let the spirit out, a superstition you'll find in a lot of homes. Weeks later, we had a new lady come in who was quite demanding, and so we moved her closer to the nursing station in the palliative care room because she was like a ninja with a frame and would zip off and hit other residents. We put her in the old boy's room, who she never knew about, and with it being a good 5 months since Ken had left, and losing others in between, no one really mentioned him anymore. In her new room, she became instantly hostile, shouting, "Get him out! Get out! Get out!" This isn't unusual for advanced dementia for people to have visual hallucinations, but we did ask her who she wanted to get out, and she said, "That big man sitting in the corner. He keeps telling me to bugger off. You bugger off, out of my room." And she continued to have an argument with the guy who wasn't there, who kept telling her to bugger off. It took us all back a bit, but kept reassuring her there was no one there. After a week, she would not settle, and we had to move her to a different room where she was then fine. Story 65. I apologize for this not being a ghost story, just an end-of-life story. I hope it's okay to share. After not speaking to her for the previous 2 years, I drove 3 hours to my physically and mentally abusive dying mother's hospital bedside when my younger brother, Ronnie, called. I didn't do it for her sake, but because my brother was in so much sorrow and pain. Our other 4 siblings had also stopped communicating with Mom. When I got to the room, her eyes were tearful, sometimes open, sometimes closed, and she steadily moaned, "Help me. Oh, help me." It just went on and on. Ron paced back and forth, crying and wringing his hands. She was on a morphine drip, and I still don't know if she knew me, but I sat close to her, held her hand, and asked what she needed. She didn't answer, so I just said, "Mom, the doctors and nurses are here to help you, and we're here to help you." She quieted down some, but moaned as if in pain, even though they had upped the morphine at Ron's request. I asked Ron for some time alone with her before we left for the night. She was completely out during that hour. I told I loved her, I forgave her, I was sorry we had been apart, and that I'd see her later. I softly sang her favorite hymns, then remembered she loved country singer George Jones, so I played his songs on my cell phone. Even though I had told myself I'd never see or talk to her again after so many years of toxic emotional and physical abuse, I'm glad I went there. I'm glad I went. I'm glad we had that hour. Ron and I left around midnight to get some sleep, and she passed away about 5 hours later. Story 66. Ugh, don't remind me. My mom used to work at an assisted living facility for old people. I visited often to keep them company, and they had a cute cat there to play with. Well, there was this one room at the end of the hall that I never liked going near as a kid. Turns out, that room is haunted. Without fail, every old person that was ever put in that room to stay would, at least one time in their stay, would call the emergency helpline for a nurse to come. When the nurse shows up, my mom in some of these cases, the person asks about the little boy/kid just outside the door. I think they're hurt. Why are you in here? Help that boy. Is that crying child okay? There was a little kid peeking into the room. Whose kid was that? Is your son visiting again? All sorts of crap like that. I don't think there was much death or anything tied to the room, but that room always got creepy calls about a kid just outside the door. This always happened well past visiting hours, so not even I was there. I hated this story as a kid, but I think my mom didn't want to be scared alone, so she would always tell me when it happened. Story 67. At my mother's viewing at the funeral home, I had my purse with my cell phone in it on the floor next to her coffin. I was busy greeting mourners, so I didn't check my phone until later. There was a draft text message on my phone. ASDFQ, ghost. ASDFQ, ghost. ASDFQ, ghost. I put my phone back in my purse and resumed greeting guests. When I went to check my phone again, the message was gone. My siblings and ex were at the viewing. They swear up and down that they didn't go into my purse or touch my phone. I think the message was by one of the other deceased spirits in the funeral home, as the embalming area was in the basement, below where we were gathered. Story 68. Years ago, when I was still in medical school, I was in the anatomy lab studying for an exam the next day. The doctor in charge of anatomy was an old family friend, and I got permission to stay there after hours. This was the third day of exams, and I was pretty tired at this point. Whenever I got too sleepy, I'd sing for a bit for a few minutes to keep myself awake, and the acoustics of the lab was like a bathroom, so I liked to sing there. I loved to sing 'Thousand Miles by Vanessa Carlton. When I got to the chorus part, if I could fall into the sky, do you think time would pass me by? 'Cause you know I'd walk 1,000 miles if I could just see you. Then I swear I heard the cadaver in the corner groan, tonight. This wasn't effing gas escaping. I know y'all are going to say that, since it was a pretty old and leathery body, and we had already dissected the abdominal cavity weeks ago. I effing took off after hearing that. Didn't stay in the lab unless there were others with me after that. Okay, how was my Vanessa Carlton impression? I think I slayed it pretty solid. I mean, maybe an octave lower, but yeah, maybe I have a future in singing. Or maybe not. Let me just keep narrating this video. Story 69. I used to clean up crime scenes. I can't really think of anything paranormal happening, but the space where a person died often carried a heavy energy. Depending on the scope of the job, you might spend hours, days, or even weeks in that person's home sorting through their belongings. My coworkers and I would sometimes feel really close to the deceased, as if we had known them, so sometimes we would sort of walk to them. For example, if I ever had a weird feeling about a place or felt bad energy, I would talk to them out loud and let them know I was just there to help, not haphazardly rummage through their personal items. One coworker would often shout at them as if he found something he didn't want to find, like if there was more damage caused to the home than we expected. He would shout something like, "What the F, Derek?" Since we were wearing 2 or more pairs of gloves and a full suit at all times, and were often moving very bulky and heavy pieces of furniture, small accidents were pretty much inevitable. I would always apologize out loud when they appeared, using their name. I thought it was important to respect the space, even if the family wasn't going to step foot inside ever again. I felt that the way we handled the situation would affect the next person moving in. To me, it was almost as if we were just cleaning. We were helping the home get rid of any bad energy associated with whatever had happened there. Story 70. Not myself, but daughter and granddaughter of funeral directors/owners. One day I was in the back break room after school when, through the dark viewing room to the left, I saw a slight pale figure moving about in the corner of my eye. Little kid me waited a second to see if I was imagining things. Walked slowly toward the front of the building, looking to my left, and the figure was there again, silently walking through a completely dark room. Got my dad, who briefly looked in, tried to talk to the person, and then called the police. Turns out, it was a girl who was not mentally all there/on drugs and had just wandered in off the street. Not a ghost, but for a minute, little kid me had jumped out of my skin. Story 71. Witnessed a ghost on home video back in 2001. One of our classmates' parents went on a tour of the Auschwitz camps and was recording video while walking into one of the crematoriums. It was an L-shaped building with one entrance and exit, with a slightly long walk to get to the crematory furnaces around the corner. They recorded walking in, and you could tell they were the only two there as they walked down the long hall. They panned the camera over to the cremation furnaces when they turned, and then panned back once they were in front of the furnaces. When the camera panned back, you could see off to the left where they were just standing a few seconds ago, clear as day, a Nazi guard in full uniform and the swastika patch on his arm. He was staring towards the furnaces. He had an unnaturally lit figure, like an old light bulb was casting an orange glow on him. There was no lights on in the building, just natural lighting from the door being open down the hall and windows at the other end. They turned to leave and walked out like normal without having seen a ghost in person. They came back to the US and watched the tapes later of their trip and saw the ghost on video. My classmate brought in their tape and our teacher showed it to us. Super creepy to see. I was in 5th grade and have been a believer of ghosts ever since. Story 72. I swamped for a haunted bar for a while. I'm not going to say it was haunted, but I completely understand why people say it was after being caught there every night after close cleaning up for a year. Crap would just open. Lights would turn off and on by themselves. Bar stools would fly off of tables randomly through the night. and not like fall off tables, but move a good 5 to 10 feet off the table. This was a big bar and had multiple rooms. You'd see a person or a shadow person walk by in the dark room while you're cleaning up the lit room, then go turn on all the lights and try to find the effer whose brilliant idea it was to hide in the bar and drink all night for free after everyone's gone, but can't find anyone anywhere. IDK, maybe it was haunted, but it was just this old crappy building that weird stuff happened in all the time. But it was always just out of sight, and just enough to startle you and make you go, WTF? No like floating specters trying to possess me or anything cool like that. Just making more work for me by throwing stools all over the damn place. Story 73. So I was working as a mortician a while back. We were called to a house where an elderly woman had lived. She passed away in the hospital the day before. We were there to plan all the further steps, like decorations for the funeral and everything else. Let's call the woman A. She had lived in that house together with her daughter B for the past decades. When we were there was the granddaughter C as well. C told us she always had an image in mind, like a premonition, that she'd go to the bathroom in that house her mother and grandmother lived in and find her grandmother dead, having died on the toilet right there. Since her grandmother had passed in the hospital, there was no way any more that could happen, of course. You can see where this is going. We hold the funeral, everything as usual, if you can/want to say that in this context. A few days after the funeral, we get a call from the same family. Another person had died, B. When we got there, C was there and told us she got up early and needed to use the restroom. And who was there? Her mother, dead, on the toilet, just like that. Story 74. I worked in a long-term care unit in a hospital, and we were haunted by a mischievous little boy. In the 6 months I was there, I heard at least 6 residents comment on the little boy, all separately and while away from other residents. A resident would giggle and say, "That little boy is making faces at me. There's a little boy hiding around the curtain. That little boy keeps running around my room." Let me reassure you, the residents didn't communicate with each other. They were all in advanced stages of Alzheimer's. For some of them, speaking an entire cohesive sentence like that was odd in itself. I was told by a senior staff that the unit used to be a pediatrics unit. Story 75. My mom and older sister Terry became estranged when Terry was 15 or 16 years old, circa 1982. To my knowledge, they had not ever spoken since. In 1999, Mom was diagnosed with a terminal illness. In her final 6 months, I visited her daily and supervised her care in a nursing home. Christmas time, she was rushed to the hospital with a spiked fever, and she slipped into a coma. After 2 weeks in a coma, a neurologist confirmed she had zero brain activity, and I, the 29-year-old, youngest of 5 children, who had been caring for her with no assistance for 6 months, was urged to remove life support. I did so, and sat holding her hand for almost exactly 24 hours, talking and singing to her. In the 23rd hour, I stood up and told her it was okay if she let go, that I would be all right, I loved her, etc. Then, without opening her eyes, she called out, "Terry?" and then flatlined. It was an honor to care for her, and I felt no ill will for her saying Terry's name. It touches me that Terry was her last thought. I shared this with Terry the next time I saw her, and she lived out of state. I don't think she believed me, but I witnessed it. Story 76. Oh my god, I have a good one, but this post is so old it's not going to be seen anyways. I used to work at a cemetery in San Diego. People would run into where I worked freaking out all the time that they saw something. These people would be clients, park visitors, and even workers. All different types of people, but they all had the same exact story, the same ghost/person, the same feeling of it approaching you, staring you in the face, the same feeling when it touches you, icy and cold, wrapping around you, making it hard to breathe, and the ice-cold feeling of it going right through your body. What's crazy is that all these people and all these stories all came from the same exact hallway in the same building, all in one exact spot. It just blows my mind that there are all these people making all these little shows and videos about catching ghosts, and we hardly see a thing. But in this one exact spot in San Diego, there is for sure a very scary haunted place, and I've never seen someone make a video about it. Story 77. Worked in the ED. One night, a major car wreck happened. Not uncommon, as it was a heavily populated area. Several dead on scene, but one person was flighted to us and they didn't survive. Their face had been peeled back and everything was a mess. We did everything we could to save them. I was the last in the room and doing the bag and tag procedure, prepping them for the morgue. I stopped all of a sudden and was alarmingly cold on the right side of my body. I looked around the room covered in blood and packaging from the tools we used to try and save them, all the while filled with immense sorrow. I could feel them right next to me. No anger, but the sorrow and confusion were palpable. They left soon after, and quietly to myself, I wished them safe passage to wherever they decided to go. Story 78. I did some volunteer work as part of a curriculum I was partaking in, and one of the options was the local cemetery, which I thought sounded great. While working there, someone had decided they wanted to move their father to a cemetery in another state to be buried next to his recently deceased wife. An excavator was brought in and they dug up the grave. We were then tasked with lifting the casket, which we did by securing it with various straps and lifting it with the excavator. Well, the casket was completely rotten and disintegrated as it was being lifted out of the hole, leaving us looking at a severely decomposed body. Another casket was brought in, and we were told to lift the body and place it in the new casket. As a volunteer, I noped out of that, but I was standing there while 3 people attempted to lift this decomposed body into the new casket and watched as it completely ripped in half. One guy started dry heaving. They ended up using shovels to gather what remains they could and scoop them into the casket to be shipped out of state. Story 79. This isn't from working in the field, but from my own brother dying. I'll be 25 soon. When I turned 22, I was having a very, very, very horrible time. I was in a marriage that was beating me down mentally, emotionally, and physically. My health was completely in the toilet, and I was in and out of ERs. I had just moved 4,000 miles, had an insane amount of debt due to said marriage, was trying to buy a house, and found out I was going to have to completely start my degree over 3 years into it. So, needless to say, I was overwhelmed, lol. It was a dark time for me. I was more stuck than I'd ever been in my life. I spent every day for months on end crying myself to sleep and trying to make plans on how to get out of my marriage with my mom and my best friend. Nothing was plausible. It was horrible. One night in particular, as per usual, I was crying myself to sleep. It was an ugly cry, the kind where your pillow is soaked with snot and water, but you don't even know which is which anymore. My ex-husband had a field op, and I was so desperate to get away, but happy to be myself. Even when he was gone, he made me feel like absolute garbage every day. I really didn't have an out, and boy, when I tell you my head was spinning. I was thinking things no one should, and I'm happy for my faith and my family because none of those thoughts ever came to fruition. When I fell asleep that night, June 25th, 2020, the day before my 23rd birthday, I had such a different dream. I dreamed about my birthday party, and it was great. My family was there, as they always were, but my family only loves you when it's convenient, except for my mom, so I wasn't happy. I knew everyone was there just because of my recent health scare, not because they loved me, and it just fed into my sadness. But then, my childhood dog, I got him after my brother died in 2004, and he passed in 2017, came running around one of the tables. It was the happiest I had been since 2017 when I got with my ex. I was so overwhelmingly happy that I cried when I saw him. I felt his fur and hugged him like I always did. That giant mutt was my absolute rock and center of my world for my entire life. He walked away and disappeared, and I was even more sad than I had been before. When I stood up, there was someone at the party that I didn't know. He was 21 and looked a lot like a cousin from my dad's side. It was all my mom's side at the party, so that was more confusing. I was crying and just wanted the day to be over, and he walked up and hugged me, and that's when I knew who it was. It was my brother. He said, "Happy birthday, Haley. I love you. I miss you, and everything's going to be okay." I woke up absolutely sobbing. It was my brother, but at the age he should have been. Exactly what he would have looked like. How did my brain do that? It's bothered me since. I told my mom about it, and she believes me, and wished it would happen to her. It's never happened again, and I wish it would. It's made me think about him all the time, and how different my life would have been if the doctors hadn't killed him. We would be so close. It's just this weird hole I can't fill. So sometimes I just sit here and wish I had that brother. I think things would have been exponentially better. I know what our dynamic would have been, and I wish so badly it could have happened. Essentially, lately, I just think a lot about how badly I wish my brother was alive. That's all. So heart goes out to you, young lady. Sounds like you've been through a heck of a lot of trauma, and thank you for sharing that story. Just wanted to give you a special shout out. I know you probably won't listen to this or watch this, but that was a great story, and definitely feeling for you there. Story 80. I worked as a nurse in a long-term medical facility. Someone recently died before my shift, and when they cleaned and prepared a new patient to occupy the room of the deceased, the door slammed shut. The deceased was in that room for 5 years, and me and the staff used the keys and force to try and open the door. It's shut tight, and when we were about to call the maintenance for force open the door, it eerily opened itself slowly, without manipulation. Then, a gust of cold wind blew over us and the patient. Luckily, the patient was non-superstitious and settled in the room without complaint. However, me and the staff hairs were raising for nearly an hour as we don't know what's the next thing that could happen. Story 81. I'm an RN, and I've seen quite a few spooky things over the years. One thing that still kind of catches me off guard is when my dying patients start reaching for and speaking to deceased friends and relatives like they're in the room. This has happened to me consistently with very alert, aware patients. For example, a patient will start reaching towards the ceiling in their hospital room and start having a conversation with whoever they see there. With some people, this starts the day before they pass. With others, it might start a week before. It always makes me feel a bit uncomfortable. Story 82. My mom, a hospice nurse, was renting a friend's house. The previous owner of the house was the friend's mother, who had recently passed away. Having worked a lot with death and the dying, my mom is not scared of ghosts at all. She told me several stories about how she would hear the rocking chair moving or newspaper rustling and knew it was her friend's mother. My mom would just say hi to her and go about her day. When I was about 20, I was staying at my mom's, and I was more than freaked out by these stories. I warned my mom that I could never be left alone in the house because I would literally die if I ever heard anything. One day, we were getting ready to go out. While I'm in the bathroom, my mom leaves the house to start packing the car. I come out of the bathroom and am getting ready to go when I hear a faint hello, hello that grows louder, and to my absolute horror, an elderly woman then turns the corner into the hallway facing me and starts walking towards me. A full-blown, in-the-flesh, haggard old woman walking towards me. I absolutely freak out and start crying and yelling at her, but she continues to walk down the hall approaching me. I'm screaming protection prayers at this woman, and she's not going away. I run into the bedroom and try to get out a window, but I can't because it's too high for me to reach. In the midst of my screaming prayers and trying to escape, I realize the woman is no longer there. I'm still in tears, screaming for my mom to come save me. My heart is racing. My mom finally comes in after and asks me why I'm yelling at her friend. It was her landlord friend, whom I had never met, coming in to say hi to me. I was so embarrassed. Okay, it's a plot twist at the end that wasn't really expecting there. That's pretty funny, though. You just scared off the landlord. You're like saying all these protection prayers and trying to smudge, and it's just an innocent old lady. Dang! That's funny. Story 83. My grandmother died last year in January. We were very close, and she was just so full of energy and life. Her death was honestly sudden and unexpected. 3 days after she had passed, I had a very vivid dream of all of us at her house, seemingly getting ready for something. I kept seeing her walking around outside with a bucket of water or birdseed. She took care of her flowers and the birds. She loved her flowers. In the dream, no one else seemed to see her. She watched over my mother as she made a new pond in the front yard. My grandmother used to have a little fish pond that us kids loved to play around and feed the fish. Finally, towards the end of the dream, my grandmother came inside the house and stood next to me, smiling and saying something to me. I couldn't understand what she was saying, and I literally felt her hand take mine in her own as she pointed up to the sky through the window. I believe she was trying to tell me everything was going to be okay and that she was going to heaven now. I woke up crying. I knew she had visited me before she did go on to heaven. I never had a dream feel so incredibly real like that before. If nothing else, it helped me get through that very rough time. I still struggle from time to time, but I definitely really needed that dream at that time. Story 84. I do not work around death or burial. Until I was in my 30s, every place we lived had some sort of crap going on that usually only I perceived. Only a couple of times did someone else witness it with me, and it was a relief because at some point I really thought I might be going insane because I couldn't rationalize it. One thing that happened to a group though, as a kid, my mom would send us off to camp. I was probably about 10 one year when we went off to a camp in the woods where all the dogs wore the same collar. They did this so the dogs wouldn't get confused with neighboring dogs, I guess. Many of us saw a husky on a regular basis. It was often lying on a plain dirt patch near the main camp. One night I had to go to the bathroom. We were required to go to the bathroom in groups of 3 or more at night, because they were in a separate building. We walk out there in a group of 5. On the way back, we heard some noise and saw the husky coming from the woods. He was acting agitated and backing slowly towards us, as if putting his body between us and something. This huge bear just comes out of the freaking woods, mad as all effing hell, and at us on its hind legs. We ran, screaming, back to camp and could hear the husky barking and growling. We immediately woke the 2 counselors in our building and told us one of the dogs was protecting us from a bear and was going to get killed. The counselor told us to stay put and ran off into the night. But they returned quite shortly after and said there was nothing there. Nothing. We were urged to go back to bed. The counselor seemed annoyed as hell, but we were more afraid that the dog was severely injured or died, saving us. The next morning, the counselors made us go to exactly where it happened. Despite there being no signs of anything, from a paw print to a broken branch, we stood by our story. So they made us talk to a more senior counselor or whatever. The first thing we said was that the husky tried to save us. The guy kind of scoffed and said that they didn't have a husky as one of the camp dogs. We all protested and said that it absolutely was, and that it had a camp collar, and we'd see it lying on that spot many times. All the color left his face. He told us that the camp used to have a husky, but it died, fighting off a bear that tried to attack 2 campers. The bear was badly wounded by the dog, but was killed by someone who worked for the park, and the spot the dog was always on was literally its grave. Sure enough, as we watched, he dusted off the top layer of dirt to a plain little memorial plaque to the dog who saved 2 campers' lives. In this case, not only had most campers seen the dog, but I had 4 eyewitnesses who saw the same thing. Story 85. Okay, so I've never worked around death or burial, but I used to live in a neighborhood in Dover, Delaware. And in this neighborhood was a funeral home, and also a cemetery was near enough. Outside was a dog statue, likely to invoke the protection of Anubis, I guess. I know that the owner, while I lived in the neighborhood, was a pagan worshiper of the Egyptian gods. Now, we were also in walking distance with a YMCA, and the lot with the statue was a direct way to it. Well, fast forward to a summer night after my junior year of high school. I just finished an evening workout and swim at the Y and was making my way back home. I didn't feel like going all the way around via the sidewalk, so I take the shortcut even though the dog statue kind of freaked me out. As I'm getting nearer, I see this guy in a white suit and hat, like the evil doctor dude from Raiders of the Lost Ark, who was smoking a pipe. The strange thing at first was that he was out here this late at night, especially because we didn't have any bars or restaurants that close to us. But another was that I couldn't smell whatever he was smoking. I remember him watching me and then him heading toward the front doors of the nursing home, shaking the locked door by the handle loud enough that I could still hear it a few streets over at my house. Next day, I get home from school and drop off my bag at my house before making a beeline for the funeral home. I told the owner what I had seen, and they pulled up the security footage from the night before. It shows me walking past the statue, then me on the sidewalk across the street, and the door shaking hard enough to be caught on camera. And then an inside view showed the door shaking and shadow figures seemingly sitting up from a variety of coffins in the showroom just a few feet from the entrance. Story 86. Just the one death, but it was my mom. She died of a rapid form of ALS. We had 9 months with her after her diagnosis. I spent basically the entire time with her, and was with her to the end. This was during the early pandemic, so she hospiced and passed away at home. Like other Redditors have mentioned, she mentioned seeing people around her. Not just one, but many shadowy shapes walking around. I want to say this was oxygen deprivation or caused by medication, but she was on supplemental O2 and wasn't able to take in her stomach much medication at all. So she was pretty much lucid aside from the anxiety. When she sat in the living room, the lights would sometimes flicker, and she told us matter-of-factly that it was them. She very much wanted her mom there with her as her health diminished. Her mom had schizophrenia and died about a decade before, and they sadly did not have very much time in their lives together. However, her mom looks a lot like me in build and size and facial features, etc. The thing that scared me a lot was when I was upstairs about to shower after a long day of caretaking, and my brother said my name questioningly from downstairs. I asked him what he wanted, and he was frightened to see me upstairs. He said he had just seen me from behind as I walked by him downstairs, in the kitchen, but my hair was different and my shirt was different. I only wear dark gray colors. He said he saw me go from my mom's room, through the kitchen, and into the garage. My brother is not a woo-woo kind of guy, and neither am I, but I think he saw my grandmother. My grandma only met him once when he was 6, but was really fascinated by him. She tried to see him in the bathroom a few times, which was odd, and I don't know what that was about. But I remember that she did that when she went to see her overseas when we were very young. Anyways, during that dying time period, my brother also came out of the shower and said he saw 2 feet sticking out from the side of the bathroom door. When he looked again, they were gone. I'm a very rational person, and on paper, I don't believe in ghosts, so this kind of stuff gives me a lot of misgivings. My mom was not mentally well when she passed. I don't know if I would be either, looking down the barrel of my own death, and said she would haunt us after she left. It has been over 2 years, and part of me is still waiting. The thing is, I love her and miss her still, and I don't know whether or not seeing her since her death is a relief or a sadness to me. Maybe one day when it's my time, I'll see her again, wherever she is, and I hope she's no longer in pain. Story 87. I'm in IT in the hospice industry. My coworker, a CNA, told me a story from our unit about a patient passing away. She heard the family was there as death was near for our patient, so she walked into the room. It was a very crowded room, walking around all the people there to do something for the patient, and then she walked out. All she really remembered was that they were dressed in their church clothes, suits and dresses. 15 minutes later, she went in and saw the nurse there alone. "Where did everyone go? Where's the family members?" she asked the nurse. The nurse looked at her and said, "She died in the last 10 minutes. The family's in the waiting area now." The family was in the waiting area, and there were only a few of them sitting there in regular clothes. She checked the other rooms, thinking perhaps she walked into the wrong room earlier because it was filled wall to wall with people. The other rooms were empty of family members or even patients, as no one was in there. She realized she never really looked at the people as she walked around them, never looked at their faces because she's only about 5 feet 2 inches tall. It kind of freaked her out. She wonders if maybe they were former family members of the patient that came to welcome her to the other side. Story 88. Nurse here. Once I was working night shift on a cardiac unit. Was a relatively normal shift. Was taking care of 5 patients, and most had just started to go to sleep. I remember vividly hearing, "Help!" from down my hall. I started running towards the end of my hall, and at that time, the telemetry monitor tech calls me and says, "Room blah 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 is showing a systole. Leads are probably off." Normally, this is the case, but not tonight. Ended up having to call a code in this room, and PT was successfully resuscitated, and PT was transferred to the ICU. Long story short, I went to go speak to the PT a couple shifts later. She stated she had, quote, walked down the hall and was calling out for help, outside of her body. I now believe in ghosts/spirits, what have you. She swears by it and states she walked out of her room calling for help. Story 89. My dad used to work in a cemetery and sometimes would just drive through it on his off time. He did this once in the winter and his car got stuck in the snow. He got out of the car to figure out what to do next and saw a beautiful lady in a white fur coat. She came over and offered to help. My dad suggested that she get in the driver's seat and hit the gas while he pushed. She said that she couldn't drive and that she would push instead. My dad tried to argue, being a gentleman and since she was so nicely dressed, but she was insistent. He got back in the car, hit the gas, and sure enough, the car was able to move through the snow to a clearer part of the road. My dad got out of the car to thank the lady, but she was gone. The only footprints in the snow were his own. My dad is a great storyteller, and we've learned to take some of what he says with a grain of salt. He gets a different look on his face when he's telling this story, though, and I think he really does believe it happened. Story 90. When I worked as a nurse on a medical floor, I rarely worked night shift, but remember a time I did get scheduled overnight around a holiday. After visiting hours ended, the security guard at the front desk would call the unit if anyone came in the hospital asking to visit a patient. One night around 1 a.m., a patient that was on hospice care passed away, peacefully and expectedly. My friend was the patient's nurse and called the family to let them know she had passed. The primary contact was her daughter, and that was who our staff had become familiar with while she was in the hospital. We knew it was going to take her about an hour to arrive. About 10 minutes later, security calls up saying a man was at the desk requesting to visit that room. We said sure, that's fine, assuming it was family that got the news. 15 minutes pass and no one comes up. We called security and he just gave us the description of the guy and his first name. Said he took the elevators but didn't see him leave the way he came in yet. When the patient's daughter finally arrived, we mentioned this to her and asked if any other family was stopping by because we were worried they got lost coming to the unit. She said her and the one other sister that came along were the only living family members. The patient had a brother who had passed fairly recently with the same name security gave us and same description. They weren't all too spooked like we were. For all we know, some random guy was roaming the hospital up to no good, but the staff did find it strange he was asking for that specific room number. It spooked us enough that a few of us went to the front desk ourselves to ask about it. The security guard sees so many people that he tried to give a good description of the guy, but couldn't really pinpoint details. I guess we'll never know. Oddly enough, I went on to work in some hospice for a few years and didn't have any specific creepy stories. With that said, I'm not super spiritual, but every deceased person, without a doubt, had their own energy and aura around them. I would have to do pronouncement visits often. Some patients would make the hair on my neck stand up, and I'd get very anxious with that impending doom feeling. Others would wash over warmth and calm feelings that would make me forget about any stress I was having. I could never anticipate what energy I'd encounter. Story 91. You know, I don't know if this counts as a ghost or not, but back in 2019, my grandfather passed away. Every single day, we would visit him in hospice before his passing. He was never conscious. He had fallen asleep in the hospital and never woke up again, but we visited him regardless. We played poker like what he taught us, watched his favorite westerns while we were gathered in the room with him, and there was always someone holding his hand. On the final day, it so happened that they had an old stereo with a Glenn Miller CD, which was his favorite album. We put it on for him, and as my favorite song, he showed me. Stardust came on. I could see his breathing grow ragged. When it switched to the next track, it switched to String of Pearls, his favorite song. He passed away 30 seconds into it, at 10:02 a.m., January 4th, 2019. 10/2 is my grandma's birthday. Watching that happen while I held his hand, well, it's the closest thing to believing in fate or ghosts or the spiritual as I could ever come to believe. I think he chose to let go at that moment. Perhaps it's the same energy that his unconscious self used to know that ghosts used to linger in the places that were important to them. I really don't know, but I do know I'll never forget him. Story 92. Well, I'm nurse here, not a coroner or anything like that. I worked at a few places picking up shifts. There was one long-term care/rehab place that had a door at the end of the hallway with a small window in it. There's a password you need to type in to get to and from, and for every number you input, there's a loud beeping that coincides with it. I worked a few days there and eventually didn't hear the damn noise anymore as therapists, dialysis patients, nursing and ancillary staff would input the codecs accidentally and trigger the alarm. My coworker was still on her med cart as I sat down to document at the nursing station out of view of the door when she asked me, "Who do we still have in therapy?" I just become numb to the beeping, but picked up on her question when I realized it was like 9 p.m., to which I told her, "None, they left at like 5. Why?" Her response, "Well, who am I looking through at the small window typing in numbers?" I stand up and take a look, to which I see the top of a tiny head just visible at the bottom of it, as if there's like a tiny old lady or man whom I didn't recognize. I sort of froze trying to process it, then took a brisk jog as she backed away, hiding into the nursing station. The head kind of wobbled back and forth out of view and never reappeared. Certainly wasn't there by the time I got to the door and opened it myself. I looked into therapy, dialysis, the side door as well, all of which are locked with alarms set, so I'd know if someone went into them. I walked back to the nursing station and told her pretty much what y'all just told here. To this day, I'm not sure what the hell it is, but I know what I saw. Story 93. When my mother was nearing death, metastatic cancer complicated by aspiration pneumonia, she would alternate between being at home and being moved to the hospital, depending upon if she was experiencing an acute crisis. She was bedridden, but in serious denial about her situation. She refused hospice services because, quote, "those are for people who are dying." Doctors offered no hope of recovery, but were not to discuss the reality of the situation with her, as she would become emotional and anxious. She hated ever needing to go to the hospital, begging to be able to go home whenever she found herself back there. But she talked about the future. All of this to say, my mom was not ready to go. She died at the hospital. The next few days, my dad reported hearing her coughing from the living room, where her hospital-grade bed had been placed during the time she would be home. This didn't surprise me, as that had been such a familiar sound for so many months. What was more odd were a couple of other things that happened within a few days of her death. 1. House doorbell ringing. No visitors ever come to the house, so that was unexpected in and of itself. But when my sister, who lived with my parents, opened the door, every time there was no one there. 2. Caller ID indicated calls from the cemetery where my mom was buried. Funeral happened a few days after her death. There was never any message left, just a record of a call. My dad would call the main office of the cemetery, and they insisted that they hadn't called. Again, this happened several times. And after maybe a week following her death and burial, it all stopped. Story 94. I was the apartment manager for a smallish community that had a few long-term residents, including one who had lived there for 30 years. She had a corner apartment tucked away from everyone else, and since the apartments had courtyards with concrete walls, you couldn't see inside her tiny corner without being nosy. Well, she and I bonded over her love of cats as she participated in trap and release for neighborhood strays. I never realized she was a hoarder or that she left her door open by using a bungee to allow room for cats to come in, but the door shut. On Tuesday that week, the 30-year resident's best friend called and asked me to do a wellness check, since I confirmed her car was still there as she never arrived to church on Sunday as normal. I called the HR and training supervisor for our company, and she told me I was to complete the wellness check along with maintenance. We found the door bungeed open, and she was straight back, completely naked, with the smell of pee on her. She was awake and somewhat coherent, but she had the signs of a massive stroke on one side of her body. She ended up having a massive heart attack on the way to the hospital, and I was the person who ended up getting the notification she had passed because she had no next of kin. The best friend was on the way to her apartment, and I had to call and divert her to the hospital afterwards. I was 23 and had literally been the last person this woman knew who she saw alive. Since she had no next of kin, and it was really before we had pushed for electronic leasing records, I had to search through her apartment for some kind of information about her family. It was so sad to hear her voicemail of missed appointments and calls from people. This poor woman lay less than 10 feet away from her home phone and had to listen to people calling, wondering where she was. It took someone 48 hours to find her, and it was me. I will never forget the stench of her cat piss-filled apartment and the smell of her own body failing her. The worst part was watching the guys who did the trash out of her apartment 2 months later, after legal bullcrap was done, and seeing the floorboard of their truck littered with a few items they found of value to take for themselves. The company was complete crap in how they handled the turnover to the resident's best friend and didn't offer an ounce of support to me in how to handle the entire situation. I was paid $15.25 an hour to run 131 apartments by myself with one maintenance guy in 2015 because the property's owner was broke and couldn't afford to pay its bills. So they put someone young and inexperienced to do the leasing and oversee the basic turnover that occasionally occurred as it was a starter property for a manager. I believe she held on until someone found her and then she gave up her fight. I hope I was a comfort to her in the end. She was a good person in our community. Story 95. Not my story, but my mother's. She worked as a student doctor in Charing Cross Hospital, London in the early 60s. I'm sure it's been renovated now, but back in the day, palliative care/terminal patients were put on this old ward. More than a few times, the patients would say it was very kind that a nurse sat on the end of their bed at night and had a calming influence. They all said she was dressed in an old-fashioned uniform and they never saw her feet. They would invariably pass away within the next 24 hours, but were calmed by the visit. She knew whenever a patient said this that their time was imminent. This had been going on for years, and one of the nurses told her that the old floor from the late 1800s/early 1900s was still there, but about 6 inches lower than the modern floor, hence the apparition appearing to have no feet. The apparition, or whatever it was walking on the old floor. The nurses never questioned it in front of the patients, as they were comforted by the presence, and they knew they would find the patient passed away the next morning. Story 96. I didn't work around death, but as a morbid young artist in university, I focused on death as a theme. It might have had something to do with the frickin' haunted apartment I lived in. Things moved or flung in my rooms. A framed picture flew off the wall. It looked like it literally lifted up the wall, then out and down. I was sitting on the toilet and the shelf above me fell on my head. A bouquet of dried flowers that I displayed on top of the kitchen cabinets somehow got removed from its container and was 4 feet away from its original spot. I also experienced an unexplainable situation where I woke up in the middle of the night. My alarm clock was flashing. There was a black cloud in my room and I was coated in green light. WTF? I refused to move and lived there for 4 years. I started saying things like, "I'm not leaving, so you better figure out how we're going to get along." LOL. Whoever lives in apartment 9, 1616 Peninsula in Winnipeg, your apartment has a ghost, or at least it did in 1997. So the approach of having an argument and giving a little sass and clapback to ghosts, that's one way to handle it. Like, why be afraid when you can just argue with it and give it the proverbial middle finger? That's funny. Story 97. Haven't worked around death or burials, but I have multiple ghost stories. I think my favorite is a story around a World War II gun my then husband bought. Can't remember where he got it, but soon after he bought it, he started having dreams about war, but didn't tell anyone. He loaned it to a friend of his who had a dream that night about war as well. They both reported the dreams as being very real and incredibly scary. I had a dream as well, just one. I was in bed and suddenly saw a soldier standing in my room. He was wearing a green uniform with a little cap on. He sent this odd flying orb to surround me, and I can remember my screams echoing inside it. Suddenly, I was outside my house, standing next to my mailbox. He'd put some vegetables in there and told me I'd have a successful and happy life. He wasn't in his uniform anymore, but in plain clothes and was behind the wheel of a little red pickup truck. There were other people too, but I couldn't see them. I got the feeling they were friends of his. They seemed happy. He drove off and I woke up with this bittersweet feeling that's impossible to explain. After that, no one had any more dreams about the war or the gun. I looked up the uniform because I wanted to know what country he was from. Best I can tell, he was an American in the infantry. I know the power of suggestion can make a person have very vivid dreams, and I'm sure I've seen many a uniform from World War II while I was awake. But I've never been able to shake the feeling that he was a real person, and after my dream, he was finally at peace. Story 98. Not a mortician. This comes from my mother back when she was a teenager. Guy she knows takes a job with the local funeral home. He works the graveyard shift. All was well for the first few months. Dude is often weirded out at work, claims that the building is haunted. Earlier in the evening, they get a call from the hospital saying that they have a lady there ready for pickup. They pick her up and the guy is freaking out, says he has a bad feeling. Later in the evening, mortician has to step out for a bit, leaving Guy there alone with the dead body. He goes about his work, still a little freaked out. Suddenly, he hears this low, soft moan. He swears it is just his mind playing tricks on him. Goes about his business. He hears it again, a little louder than last time. It is late. He is alone. He's just hearing things, probably just the pipe settling. The plumbing is old after all. Short time passes and it's louder. At this point, he's sure he isn't just imagining things. He knows he heard the dead lady moan. His first thought was the mortician was effing with him. He has been shaken all evening and this a-hole is pranking him. He marches over. Very funny, you dick. Yanks back the sheet covering the dead lady, expecting to find the mortician somewhere around her. Dead lady grabs the guy's wrist. He lets out this scream and bolts for the door. Forgets his car and runs all the way home. Turns out, old lady wasn't dead. Hospital got it wrong. Hooray, 1950s medicine. She had been in a coma or something, and they had been sure she had passed on earlier that morning. She woke up at the funeral home and scared the ever-loving hell out of the assistant. He quit the next day and said he would never set foot there ever again. Story 99. While I've not worked around it, my best friend used to live in the upstairs part of an old funeral home that was family-owned since the 1920s. They made a separate building in the back that's the actual funeral home/crematorium. Some workers said that they could see an old man in a suit wandering around the grounds, but I've never seen him. What I have experienced in the upstairs part was mostly footsteps and knocking on walls/doors. Not like old house creaks, but more like knocking to answer the door. I spent the night once and slept in his living room. It was dark and I was on my phone, not paying attention, when I heard the door to the living room slowly squeak open and could hear steps as if someone was walking in. Every time I would look up towards the noise, it would stop. I remember it felt like the room got really cold. The steps eventually made its way all the way to the couch I was on, and finally it stopped. I heard footsteps quite a few times hanging out there. He had amateur ghost hunters come in once and set up a camera in his bedroom and filmed while he slept. You could see on the video the door open, hear steps walk in, and could see the compression at the foot of his bed as if someone got into his bed while he slept. After he saw that video, he ended up staying with his mom for a few months until he could get the courage to go back home. Story 100. I never worked around death/burial, but my father was murdered when I was a teenager. There's a really long history, and we know who did it, but they've never been charged. That being said, the coroner knew it was a murder, and there was a big cover-up. Me and my sister did the digging a year later and found the original, which stated foul play. At his funeral, my BIL and some of my brothers and family friends were carrying him away, and I saw him standing at the entryway. At least 5 times a month after, I would have dreams of him holding my face, crying and begging me for help, and to find them. One time, it was a dream of him standing near water, and when he turned, he had a blue face, how they found him, saying they were coming to find him. We went to the state with all evidence, and they never helped us. Story 101. When my grandma was in the end stage of her young life, 61, I was always at the hospital with her. The entire time she was there, they had her heavily sedated with morphine. I remember watching TV in her room, and they had just announced the death of Desi Arnaz. I'll never forget, because I Love Lucy has always been a beloved favorite in my household. Anyway, the next day or so, it came to me that my grandma was hanging on because she was very worried about me and my mom. We weren't getting along very well at the time. Anyway, I held her hand and told her that if she wanted to go, that she could, even though my heart was breaking. I told her that my mom and I would be all right and that we'd work things out, so if she wanted to go with my grandpa, that she could go peacefully. Suddenly, she opened her beautiful blue eyes and just stared straight ahead. I dropped her hand and called out for Julie, who was her nurse. I've never forgotten her for all her kindness. She took my grandma's pulse and told me she was very close if I wanted to call my mom. My mom came right away, and I remember holding my grandmother's hand and my mom holding her other hand on the other side of the bed. My grandmother's eyes were still open, looking ahead of her, and my mom and I both told her how much we loved her and that if she wanted to go, to not worry about us, that we would be okay. Suddenly, her eyes closed. She made a couple of gestures as if she was in pain, and then she stopped breathing. My beautiful, beloved grandmother was waiting for our permission to pass on. Well, it took quite a while for my mom and I to work it out, but I'm happy to say that everything turned out all right between us. Now I'm 61, and I just lost my mom this past December 17th. She was just 15 days into her 79th year, and since we live in separate states and it was unexpected, nobody was with her. I pray that my grandparents were there to meet her. Bye, Mom. I love you. Story 102. Obligatory, I don't work in a morgue, but story is relevant. I was on a bachelorette trip in Helen, Georgia, with the bride and some of her friends. I have bad asthma and had been having issues breathing before the trip, but still wanted to go, so I brought my nebulizer machine with me to use. We rented a really beautiful little cabin up in the woods, but the roads were windy and we got turned around on the way up. The wrong turn accidentally led us to a really old, really small family cemetery. We just turned around and eventually found the place. I had already volunteered to sleep on the couch. Not enough bedrooms, and the couch was comfy. That was off of the kitchen. Not a big deal. One of the first nights we were there, I remember half waking up, absolutely struggling to breathe, and coughing a lot. A nice-looking younger guy quietly came over, smiled at me, and helped load my mask with meds before placing it over my face. He then fixed the blanket covering me, turned on the nebulizer, and walked out of view, presumably into the living room. I felt so tired and dozed off again not long after. Next morning, we were all eating breakfast, and I casually asked whose boyfriend had arrived late last night. All of the girls just looked at me, bewildered. I explained what had happened and how when I woke up, the machine was off and the mask was hanging on the arm of the couch. I said I just wanted to thank whoever it was. The girls all nervously looked at me and reiterated that none of their partners were there, or even in the state. We ended up leaving for a ziplining excursion, and I had to put it out of my head for a while. When we came back, though, I decided to take a walk through the woods with one of the other girls. Ended up back at the cemetery we'd found earlier. There were only 7 to 8 grave markers, and most were so worn that you couldn't see names/dates, except one. It was for a young man about our age. I felt a warm pressure around my shoulders, like someone putting a blanket or sweater on me, but when I turned, no one was there. The girl who was with me relayed the name on the grave to the others when we got back, and we spent the rest of our time there greeting him and saying goodbye to him out loud when we'd come and go. Never saw him again, though. Story 103. This one comes from my father and his brother years ago. In the old days in rural areas, pre-1960s, funeral home hearses had a fold-out cot, a siren, and did double duty as ambulances before rural areas had dedicated ambulances. My father was good friends with a man named Roy, the local funeral home director/owner. One day he came out to see my father. He had to make a run to the cities about 240 miles away and pick up a body and wanted some driving help. This was the days before the interstate system. My father had other obligations, but my uncle was free to go, so they hopped in and took off. Roy told my uncle, "You drive and I'll get some rest for the trip back." He goes in the back, folds out the cot, and lays down. They get near their destination, and my uncle pulls into an all-night gas station for a break. The only person working at this station after midnight was some poor college kid working his way through school pumping gas. It's in the fall of the year. A cold wind is blowing the leaves around. My uncle tells him to fill it up and goes to the men's room. Roy wakes up, notices the hearse isn't moving, and hears the gas gurgling into the tank. Sits up, pushes open the curtain, raps on the window, and says, "Hey kid, where are we?" That poor kid sprayed gas all over the fender of that hearse. It took him almost an hour to get that poor guy calmed back down. Story 104. I worked in a hospital as a housekeeper for a summer. One night, I was assigned to clean the morgue. I was told that the room would already be clean. I just needed to grab the trash. What they didn't tell me is that the room had automatic lights. I opened the door to the dark room full of dead bodies and freezers, and the lights all turned on. Scared me so bad.